Welcome to True Crime for Sleeping. This is a calm space where we tell real, haunting true crime stories in a slow, immersive way, so you can drift off while listening or simply unwind. If you enjoy these stories, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting to let us know where in the world you're listening from. Your support helps us keep making these gentle, thoughtful stories. Now, let's begin. The quiet house on Orchard Lane, Wellington, Minnesota, wasn't a place most people ever heard about. Just 2,000 residents, a few stoplights, a diner that hadn't updated its menu since 1983, and a lake ringed with pine trees that turned golden in the fall. It was the kind of town where strangers stood out, where the mail carrier knew everyone's dog's name, and where nothing really happened until it did. The quiet didn't break all at once. It began like most stories do, softly, with a few hushed concerns that didn't reach beyond porch steps and whispered phone calls. At the center of it all was a man named Mark Travers, a respected teacher at Wellington High School, and his wife Delia, a part-time librarian with an unassuming nature and a fondness for gardening. They lived on Orchard Lane in a modest butter-yellow house, with faded shutters and wind chimes that never stopped singing. For 15 years, the Travers had been fixtures of Wellington life. Mark taught history, coached the debate team, and offered SAT tutoring on weekends. Delia managed the children's reading hour at the library, kept to herself mostly, and tended to her backyard vegetable patch with quiet precision. If anyone had noticed something off about the Travers, it never went beyond idle speculation. They didn't have children, which wasn't all that unusual, but Mark rarely mentioned family, and Delia rarely left town. Still, they showed up at every community event, potluck and holiday festival, smiling, bringing cornbread or potato salad, waving politely. They were by all visible signs, ordinary, until October 7th. That morning, Delia Travers called 911. Her voice was strained but calm. She said her husband hadn't come home the night before. He'd gone to a debate team mixer at the high school and never returned. She'd waited, checked his usual routes, called his phone repeatedly, but no answer. It wasn't like him, not at all. Wellington's single patrol officer, Deputy Hannah Nilsson, was the first to arrive. She knew the Travers well. Mark had taught her niece the year before, and she expected the situation to resolve quickly. A flat tire, maybe. A night spent at a friend's. Small-town life wasn't built for dramatic exits, but Mark's car wasn't found on any of the roads leading out of town. His phone was dead, and his colleagues at the school said he'd left the mixer around 8 p.m., cheerful and sober, saying he had to get home to Delia. By the following day, search efforts were underway. The town's volunteer fire crew scoured nearby trails. Drones flew over the lake. Local divers checked the water's edge. Nothing. It didn't make sense. 3 days in, reporters from Minneapolis picked up the story. Beloved small-town teacher vanishes without a trace, the headlines read. Wellington, unaccustomed to cameras and journalists, grew unsettled. People left their porch lights on. Children were kept indoors after dark. Rumors festered. One neighbor said he'd heard an argument coming from the Travers house late Thursday night, a woman shouting something sharp and angry. Another claimed they saw Delia early the next morning, standing by her backyard shed, barefoot, staring at something no one else could see. Still, the sheriff's office had nothing solid. No signs of struggle, no body, no blood. Just the vanishing of a man whose life seemed tightly stitched to the town around him. But something small changed everything. On the 6th day, a librarian named Gina Park discovered that several books Delia had checked out months earlier were long overdue. Most were gardening books or true crime anthologies, nothing too strange. But one stood out. A book on forensic cleaning techniques. Gina hadn't thought much of it until that morning, when Delia returned it through the after-hours slot. Gina noticed the book's cover was warped, like it had been exposed to steam, or worse. She glanced inside and saw faint, rust-colored stains on a few pages. She hesitated, then called the sheriff's office. The book was collected and examined. Preliminary tests showed the stains were in fact blood, though not enough to match conclusively. But the finding prompted a formal search of the Travers home. Delia, when questioned, appeared shaken but cooperative. She allowed the officers inside, watched silently as they moved through her kitchen, her living room, the narrow hallway lined with framed photos from family camping trips and graduations. Mark smiled in most of them. His eyes were kind. The officers didn't find anything unusual until they reached the basement. The floor had recently been scrubbed. Not just cleaned, but scrubbed. Harsh chemicals, bleach, faint scratches on the cement. The drain in the middle of the floor still had flecks of something lodged around the rim. Forensics was called in. The next few days unfolded slowly, with dread growing by the hour. Tests confirmed that the residue from the basement matched Mark's blood type. Further analysis confirmed it was his. Now the search for a missing man became a homicide investigation. Delia was brought in again for questioning. Her composure had shifted, less steady now, more distant. She said she had no idea how the blood got there. Said Mark sometimes worked on projects in the basement, though couldn't say what kind. He had his own world down there, she said. Investigators began peeling back the layers of the Travis's marriage. It wasn't what anyone thought. Private emails between Delia and a man named Joel, someone she'd met years ago through an online poetry forum, were recovered. The tone was emotional, confessional, even romantic. Delia had described herself as trapped, her husband as overbearing, and the town as a cage made of kindness. She spoke of leaving, of needing freedom, of escape. Joel lived in Chicago. He had never visited Wellington, but his correspondence with Delia had grown intense over the past year. He said he hadn't heard from her since the day Mark vanished. To those who knew Delia, this revelation landed like thunder. She had always been so quiet, so modest, so ordinary. But behind that facade was something else, a yearning, a darkness perhaps even she didn't fully understand. More details surfaced. Mark's phone, though off, had pinged once near the lake trail, the night he disappeared. A single text was sent to Delia, around 8:14 p.m. I know it read. She never responded. When asked about the message, Delia claimed she never received it. Investigators weren't convinced. Then on October 20th, cadaver dogs brought in from the state found something buried in the wooded area behind the Travers property, less than 200 yards from their backyard shed. It was a duffel bag. Inside were men's clothes, heavily stained, along with a rusted hammer, traces of blood, and one of Mark's wristwatches. There was still no body, but prosecutors felt they had enough. Delia Travers was arrested for the suspected murder of her husband. The town reacted with a mix of shock and a strange kind of grief. There were no protests, no shouting matches in the street, just quiet withdrawal. People stopped meeting at the diner. The library shut early. The leaves continued to fall, blanketing Orchard Lane in gold and rust, as if trying to bury the truth beneath them. The house at the end of the street, once so full of warmth and quiet routines, now stood empty. But inside that silence, questions still echoed. What really happened that night? And could someone so invisible really be capable of something so final? Delia Travers sat in a holding cell on the second floor of the county sheriff's office, a few blocks from where she used to stack books and straighten reading pillows in the children's section of the Wellington Public Library. Her hands, resting gently on the tabletop, looked small and pale beneath the overhead light. When Sheriff Tom Adler entered the room, she greeted him with a faint nod, her gaze never quite meeting his. Tom had known Delia for almost 20 years. They'd served together on the library's board of trustees, and shared polite exchanges at every town meeting. He remembered when she'd organized the annual seed swap, how she brought hand-labeled envelopes filled with heirloom tomatoes and wildflower mixes, and how she'd once cried silently during a community screening of To Kill a Mockingbird. He hadn't imagined he'd ever see her like this. She asked for tea chamomile if possible, and he brought it to her himself, placing the warm cup between her hands. She whispered a thank you. We found the duffel bag, he said after a moment. Delia blinked slowly, then looked down into her tea. I heard. We've tested the hammer. Your husband's blood was on it. Her face didn't change, but her throat moved as she swallowed. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not yet." The investigation pressed forward, even without a confession. Forensic teams continued combing through the Travers property. The basement yielded more than initially discovered: fragments of tissue near the drain, a single broken button in the corner by the water heater, and microscopic traces of bleach embedded deep in the concrete floor. It had been cleaned meticulously, almost professionally. Yet not even bleach could erase everything. The search for Mark's body continued through the pine woods, along creek beds, and beneath felled logs where mushrooms bloomed from decay. It became a solemn ritual, volunteers waking early, forming lines, moving together in silence. No one talked much anymore. The weight of not knowing was pressing heavily on everyone. Back in the sheriff's office, deputies were reconstructing a timeline. Mark had left the school at 7:58 p.m. According to security footage, he was seen walking to his car, waving to a student. At 8:14 p.m., his phone sent a final message: "I know." By 9 p.m., his phone had gone offline. It pinged briefly near the lake trail, but never again. Delia said she had fallen asleep waiting for him, but a neighbor's security camera captured her walking through the backyard at 9:32 p.m., carrying what looked like a shovel. The image was grainy and indistinct, but her outline was clear enough. Still without a body or an eyewitness, the case was largely circumstantial. Delia's attorney argued as much. He portrayed her as a woman under stress, unfairly judged by her community, made a suspect by grief and small-town gossip. He claimed the emails to Joel were no more than a poetic fantasy, a harmless venting space in the face of a distant marriage. He questioned the blood evidence, how much, how conclusive, and pointed out that the hammer could have been planted. That Delia's silence wasn't guilt. It was shock. But beneath those courtroom debates, the town held its own quiet court of opinion. The people of Wellington didn't shout. They didn't argue on street corners, or post conspiracies on message boards. They just pulled back. They passed Delia's house without looking. They whispered Delia's name less. They withdrew casseroles, cancelled book club meetings, stopped waving from their porches. Delia's world shrank. Her bail was denied, and she was transferred to the women's facility, 40 miles north, where the concrete walls echoed more than footsteps. Her attorney visited weekly. She rarely spoke. Joel, the man from Chicago, released a public statement, saying he was shocked and saddened, and that he had cut off all contact with Delia. No charges were brought against him. He hadn't known enough to be complicit. And still, there was no body. That absence gnawed at the edges of the case. Sheriff Adler had walked the woods himself many times, retracing steps, looking for depressions in the soil, unnatural arrangements of stone, broken patterns in the undergrowth. The search was methodical, even spiritual at times, following instincts more than maps. In early November, after a hard frost blanketed the ground, something unexpected happened. A dog, an old golden retriever named Gus, wandered from his owner's property just beyond the southern edge of town. He returned with something in his mouth. At first glance, it looked like a large dirty bone. It wasn't. The remains were confirmed to be human, scattered, partially buried, and wrapped in fragments of plastic sheeting that had been torn by time and animals. There wasn't much left, but enough for DNA testing. It was Mark Travers. The medical examiner estimated he had died between 8:30 and 9 p.m., the night of his disappearance. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Multiple strikes. He had likely been killed in the basement, as the evidence suggested, and moved during the night. The burial site was shallow, hasty, hidden beneath a lattice of dead branches and pine needles, not more than 20 yards off a narrow walking path. Delia's defense crumbled. Faced with the evidence, she asked to speak to Sheriff Adler privately. He found her sitting at the edge of the interview room, staring at the wall. When he entered, she didn't turn to face him. She spoke in a low voice. "I never meant to become this," she said. "What happened that night, Delia?" She closed her eyes. "We argued. About Joel. He found the messages. I told him they didn't mean anything, but he was so angry, he started shouting, pacing, said I'd humiliated him. I said I felt invisible, that I didn't know who I was anymore. Her voice cracked. He said maybe it was time we ended things, that he should leave, that he'd tell everyone about the affair. She paused for a long time. I don't remember picking it up, she said finally. The hammer. I just remember his face. The way he looked at me, like I was a stranger. There was silence between them. You hit him, Adler said softly. I didn't stop, she replied. He waited. I panicked. I cleaned the floor. I wrapped him in that old shower curtain. I thought, if no one saw, maybe it wouldn't be real. Delia lowered her head into her hands. I buried him near the trail, somewhere he liked to walk. I thought, it would be quiet there. Her confession was recorded, documented, and sealed into the case file. The town received the news with a numb kind of grief. There was no vindication, no relief, just the slow closing of a wound that would never quite heal. The Travers home was sold the following spring. A young couple from St. Paul moved in, unaware at first of what had happened there. They repainted the shutters, tore out the vegetable garden, and filled the backyard shed with tools and camping gear. The wind chimes remained. Delia Travers was sentenced to 28 years in prison. She declined to appeal. She requested only one item in her cell, a small framed photo of Mark taken on a camping trip in 2009. In it he's smiling beside a river, the sun caught in his hair, his hands muddy from catching frogs for the neighbors' kids. Delia never remarried, never spoke to Joel again, and never offered more than the one confession. In time, the town began to return to something like normal. Children played outside again. Porch lights were switched off at night. The library reopened its seed swap. But something in Wellington had changed. The kind of change that doesn't shout, but settles deep, like snow. The kind that makes people look twice at the quiet house on the corner, and wonder what lies beneath the silence. It was spring again, when the trial officially concluded. The snow had long melted from the shoulders of Wellington's narrow streets, revealing potholes and the faint lines of last year's leaf piles. Life, as it tends to do, had moved on in slow increments. But beneath the return of green grass and songbirds, the quiet fractures remained, subtle but present in everything. The courthouse steps, once flooded with reporters and curious onlookers, stood empty now. No one wanted to remember how eager they'd been to whisper about Delia Travers, how quickly they'd speculated, filled in blanks with their own dark imaginations. That part of town life had become its own unspoken shame. And yet, the space Delia left behind didn't vanish with her conviction. It lingered in small, persistent ways. Empty chairs at committee meetings, a missing voice during Sunday hymnal, her absence most felt in those routines she'd once fulfilled without thanks or notice. The women at the church still prepared meals for new mothers and homebound neighbors, but none labeled the containers with Delia's neat handwriting anymore. The book club resumed, but there was an unspoken avoidance of psychological thrillers or stories involving affairs. And in the library, the children's section sat just a little quieter. Sheriff Tom Adler retired that same year. He didn't make a big announcement about it. No party, no ceremony, just a letter submitted to the county, and a quiet handshake with his deputy, a woman named Marie Jensen, who had quietly earned the town's trust during the investigation. She took over the role with grace, and a firm understanding of what silence could mean. Tom spent his first weeks of retirement walking his dog, chopping wood and putting away the boxes of documents he hadn't been able to let go of. The Travers case, every file, every transcript, every crime scene photo, he stored in his basement, in a locked metal cabinet. He told himself he was keeping them for legal reasons, but deep down, he simply couldn't let go of the feeling that something about it still didn't sit right. It wasn't that he doubted Delia's confession. She had spoken clearly, without embellishment or hesitation. Her description of the night Mark died had been chilling in its simplicity. No dramatic retelling,
No attempts to soften her actions. She'd killed him during an argument, and buried his body alone, and her only regret, as she said, was that she hadn't left him before it reached that point. Still, Tom wondered, not about her guilt, but about the timeline, the phone message, and the peculiar detachment Delia had shown not just afterward, but in the years leading up to that night. There had been signs, he thought. Mark's declining health, the change in Delia's clothing, the sudden end to her friendship with Naomi Bell, the woman who used to run the farmer's market stall next to her. Those quiet breaks in her life. When Tom finally drove out to the property, one final time before handing over the keys to the new owners, he parked by the rusting garden fence, and stood beneath the skeletal frame of what had been the arbor. The roses were gone. The vines had withered, but the wind chimes still moved. He walked slowly around the house. The basement door was locked, the windows clean. The scent of bleach was long gone, replaced by dust and emptiness. The garden lay dormant. A few of Delia's perennials had returned, stubbornly pushing through the earth hostas, mostly hardy and silent. In the back shed, he found something unexpected. Behind a rotting stack of firewood, tucked into a dry corner near the baseboard, was a small red notebook. Its spine was cracked and water-stained, but inside the pages were mostly intact. The entries were written in Delia's handwriting, short, spare notes, some no more than a sentence or two, dated sporadically. The earliest entry read, May 3rd. He forgot our anniversary again. Didn't even notice the flowers. May 11th. Joel says my letters are the only thing keeping him sane. June 7th. Mark found the email. Said I'm selfish. Said I'm nothing. July 1st. If I disappear, would anyone ask why? The entries grew darker as the summer went on. Delia's reflections wavered between longing and loathing, love and guilt. She wrote about dreams of leaving, of escaping into a life that felt truly hers. She spoke of Mark less and less. Her tone turned clinical, almost cold. But one entry stopped Tom cold. August 14th. He said I don't need to be afraid anymore, that everything would be taken care of. I just had to say yes. I didn't say anything. Who was he? It wasn't Mark. The context made that clear, and if it wasn't Joel, who had maintained throughout that he hadn't spoken with Delia in person, then who? Tom made a copy of the notebook before turning it into the department. Deputy Jensen added it to the official evidence file. Legally it changed nothing. Delia had confessed. The remains had been identified. The conviction was secure, but it left Tom with an ache he couldn't name. Back at the prison, Delia declined to discuss the notebook. She admitted it was hers, but she called the entry a metaphor, something she'd written in a low moment. Nothing real. No one had said those words to her, she claimed. It was just a way to externalize a feeling. But Tom had read too many confessions over the years to accept that explanation at face value. The summer passed, and then the following fall. In early October, a journalist from the Minneapolis Record, a quiet investigative publication known for its slow in-depth reporting, reached out to Tom. Her name was Sarah Kim, and she was working on a piece about rural domestic homicides, and the patterns that often go unnoticed in small-town law enforcement files. She'd read about the Travers case, and had questions. Tom, cautious at first, agreed to meet her for coffee. They talked for hours. About Wellington. About Mark and Delia. About silence and isolation, and the weight of expectations. Tom showed her the red notebook, off the record. Sarah took careful notes. When she published her piece 4 months later, it didn't make national headlines, it didn't go viral, but within certain circles, advocacy groups, criminology circles, and survivors of domestic abuse, it resonated deeply. Her article, titled The Quiet Undoing, focused less on the murder itself, and more on the years that led up to it, the signs that had gone unnoticed. The slow erosion of self that could occur behind neat garden fences and baked pies. Sarah argued, gently but persuasively, that Delia hadn't just snapped, but had spent years slowly disappearing into a life where she no longer recognized herself. She did not justify the killing, but she painted a fuller picture of a woman who had lost her voice long before she raised her hand. The piece brought new attention to the case. Not to reopen it, but to learn from it. Panels were formed. Training programs began to emerge for rural law enforcement officers on identifying coercive control, emotional abuse, and signs of chronic psychological manipulation, factors that often left no bruises, but could unravel lives nonetheless. In Wellington, the response was more muted. Some praised the article for its honesty. Others dismissed it as an attempt to excuse murder. But for the first time in a long while, people began to talk. Not about Delia's guilt or innocence, but about what people carried silently. About what it meant to know your neighbor. About how someone could be present in every church fundraiser, every PTA meeting, and still be vanishing inside. Tom Adler read the article twice. Then he folded it carefully, and placed it inside the red notebook, which he kept in a small fireproof box in his study. He would never claim to understand everything that happened in the Travers home, but he understood something now that he hadn't before. That the truth wasn't always found in blood tests and timelines. Sometimes, it was found in what went unsaid. Wellington returned to quiet, after the article faded from circulation. The roads cracked under the cold again, and the prairie wind returned, pushing dry leaves against fence posts and power poles. The small town settled back into its rhythms. In a place like this, the seasons often marked time more clearly than events did. But time had shifted, even if imperceptibly. The Travers house, long empty, was eventually bought by a couple from out of town. They were artists, glass blowers, and had fallen in love with the property's solitude and natural light. They stripped the garden down to bare earth, then replanted it with wildflowers and prairie grass, hoping to let the land breathe again. They never asked the neighbors about the house's past. Most didn't volunteer it. Sheriff Tom Adler, now fully retired, took up woodworking. He built small simple things, stools, birdhouses, frames. He gave them away or stacked them in the garage. Sometimes he didn't even finish them, just let the work exist halfway, as if to say not everything had to be whole to be real. He kept in touch with Sarah Kim, the journalist. They spoke every few months, usually on the phone. She had gone on to cover similar cases, quiet disappearances, small town secrets, the patterns of erasure in women's lives that rarely made headlines. But the Travers story had stayed with her. There was something about Delia, she said. Not just what she had done, but who she had become before it happened. A person hollowed out by 1,000 small indignities. Her voice, her desires, her space, each stripped away gradually, imperceptibly, until what remained was a shadow with a perfect casserole and a buried man in the cellar. Sarah had tried once to speak with Delia again. She'd written a letter, measured, compassionate, free of judgment, but never received a reply. A month later, the letter came back with return to sender marked in black ink. Delia had transferred facilities, and her new location was undisclosed. Even Tom didn't know where she was anymore. And maybe that was for the best. In Wellington, the Travers name wasn't spoken much. Not out of shame, but because in some ways there was nothing left to say. The people who had known her best had either moved, grown distant, or quietly restructured their memories. It's easier to rewrite a story when it's too heavy to carry. But not everyone forgot. One Sunday in March, Evelyn Harper, a longtime librarian and soft-spoken woman with a fondness for cardigans and lemon tea, found a folded piece of paper tucked into the back of the bell jar on the library shelf. She had been reshelving books after story hour, when it slipped out and landed near her foot. She picked it up, smoothed the crease, and read. It was written in pencil on lined paper, old but not weathered. Sometimes I don't remember what I wanted before. I only remember learning to want less, to take up less space, to apologize before speaking. I thought if I was small enough, maybe I wouldn't make waves. But even silence makes noise, eventually. There was no name, no date, just the handwriting. Sharp, neat, unmistakably Delia's. Evelyn slipped the note into her pocket and quietly returned to her duties. She didn't tell anyone, didn't share it with the new sheriff, or the local historical society, or even her husband. Some things, she thought, weren't meant to be analyzed, they were simply meant to be kept safe. The memory of Delia Travers became, in time, more of a cautionary echo than a person. She wasn't glorified or vilified. Her story existed in the gaps between a neighbor's uncertain glance and a teacher's long pause before taking attendance during a training seminar. She had become a symbol of something much larger than the crime itself. And Mark Travers, his name faded faster. There were no memorials, no plaques or dedications. His grave, modest and unmarked by ceremony, remained in the cemetery outside of town, overgrown by weeds and set apart from the others. His family never returned to Wellington. There were whispers of an estranged sister somewhere in Oregon, but she never claimed his belongings. Eventually, what few items remained in storage were auctioned off. Old tools, a few shirts, and a set of encyclopedias. People assumed he had been a difficult man. Some said he drank too much. Others remembered how he rarely made eye contact in conversation, how he had how Delia had once come to church with a bruised wrist and claimed she'd fallen on the stairs, but no one had intervened. Not really. Even now, there was a collective guilt beneath the town's breath, soft, unspoken, and unavoidable. It clung like morning fog, not because they had loved him, or even known him well, but because they had all looked away. The signs had been there, they always were. In hindsight, in the fall of the following year, a group of local women began a small informal support circle at the town hall. They met every other Thursday, and called it the Lantern Group. They said it was for women's wellness, but in time it became a space where survivors of quiet abuse could speak. They didn't name Delia. They didn't need to.
The town changed, subtly, not in overt ways, but in the shifting of assumptions. The women's shelter in the next county over saw a small uptick in funding from anonymous donors. The school added new training for teachers to recognize signs of stress in students' home lives. And at the annual Christmas parade, when a young girl tripped and her father barked her name sharply, several heads turned, not out of nosiness, but out of instinct. That was what remained of the Travers story. Not the scandal, not the murder, but the awareness it had forced into being. A reckoning with the limitations of politeness. A confrontation with the belief that silence was safety. The realization that someone can be kind in public and cruel in private, and that both things can exist in one person without contradiction. Sheriff Jensen kept the red notebook in her office, in a locked drawer. She read it once a year, always in private, always in silence. Not as evidence, but as testimony. A record of erosion. She believed in justice, but she also understood that justice doesn't always feel like closure. Sometimes, it's just a place to stop digging. And Delia, she existed now as a number in a system. In a facility with cinder-block walls and numbered uniforms. She worked in the laundry room. She kept to herself. She declined interviews. She received no visitors. But she wrote letters. Not to Joel, not anymore, but to herself. Journal entries, short stories, poems. A volunteer from a non-profit literacy program sent her prompts once a week, and she responded without fail. Her words were collected, typed, and saved. No one knew what would become of them. Maybe nothing. Or maybe, years from now, someone would read them and see not just a crime, but a quiet scream that had gone unheard for far too long. Because that was the truth that Wellington, like so many towns, had come to face. That silence doesn't protect. It festers, it calcifies, and eventually, it cracks. So the town kept moving forward, not forgetting, but carrying, not forgiving, but understanding. And in that small, painful, necessary shift, there was hope. Not for Delia, not for Mark, but for those still living behind closed doors, wondering if anyone could see the truth behind their smiles. The Virginia coastline is dotted with quiet, forgotten places, thin barrier islands, old fishing towns, and cul-de-sacs that wind like lazy rivers into marshy woods. Sandbridge Hollow was one of those places. a narrow spit of beach and back roads, nestled just south of Virginia Beach, where sea oats bent in the breeze and houses stood on stilts above the brackish soil. It wasn't a place people moved to, it was a place people stayed. Generations stacked atop generations, fathers who fished like their fathers before them, mothers who taught Sunday school in the same chapel where they'd been baptized. People knew each other's names, birthdays and secrets. Mostly. In the summer of 1992, the town was quietly preparing for tourist season. The rental homes were being hosed down, crab pots cleaned and stacked, and the general store had just restocked its racks with postcards and sand dollars. Life moved slowly, with the comfort of routine. And then, one boy didn't come home. His name was Caleb Rooker, 11 years old, soft-spoken, with hair the color of corn silk and a permanent tan that came from barefoot afternoons chasing fiddler crabs across the Sound. He lived on Sandglass Drive, 3 houses down from the end of the cul-de-sac, in a salt-stained bungalow with peeling shutters and a wind chime that sang every time the tide shifted. On the afternoon of June 6th, Caleb had told his mother he was going down to the dunes to look for turtle nests. It was something he often did, a solitary child, more at home among dunes and birds than other kids. He promised to be back before dark. He never was. When the sun dipped below the pines that evening and the porch light buzzed on, Donna Rooker called his name. She wasn't worried yet. Caleb sometimes got distracted, watched the osprey nests or lost track of time chasing ghost crabs. But when an hour passed and the sky turned violet, Donna began to walk. She carried her flashlight and his name through the tall grass, calling into the wind. She walked the length of the shoreline, her flashlight beam trembling over tire ruts and shells. By 10 p.m., she called the sheriff. The search began that night. Flashlights bobbed like fireflies across the dunes and through the thick maritime forest that bordered the town's edge. Volunteers spread out, some on foot, others on ATVs, combing the terrain. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the only sound was the distant crash of waves. No one found Caleb. The next morning, the state police arrived. They brought dogs, drones, and a mobile command unit that looked out of place beside the shrimp shack and bait shop. Reporters followed soon after. Their vans lined the street outside the Rooker house, satellite dishes pointed skyward, but the town didn't welcome them. Sandbridge Hollow was not built for tragedy. It was a place of small pains, boats lost to hurricanes, marriages fraying quietly, sons leaving for the Navy and never quite returning. Not this, not a missing child. Flyers went up on every utility pole. Caleb's face, a school portrait with a crooked smile and freckles, looked out from the gas station, the church, even the bar. His eyes were blue. He had last been seen wearing a faded yellow shirt with a cartoon turtle on the front and brown corduroy shorts. His bike was found 2 days later, leaning against a weathered fence near the trail that led into the dunes. The tires were dusty but not flat. There was no sign of a struggle, just the bike, as if Caleb had stepped off and vanished. That discovery only deepened the mystery. The dunes were expansive, layered with sand, seagrass and thickets of wax myrtle and bayberry, but they were not endless. Searchers had covered every inch, and still, nothing. No footprints, no blood, no fabric, no sign. Donna Rooker, once shy and reserved, became steel overnight. She attended every press briefing, demanded FBI involvement, and gave interviews on the lawn while reporters adjusted their microphones. Her voice was calm, measured. She refused to cry on camera. Her son, she insisted, was not a runaway. He was content, she said. Quiet, yes, but not unhappy. He never even talked back. But the sheriff, Walt Evers, a lifelong local, wasn't so sure. He didn't say it publicly, but in private he wondered. Caleb was a solitary boy. He'd struggled socially at school, rarely joined games at recess, and had once gone missing for half a day before being found asleep in an abandoned boathouse. Maybe he'd just wandered farther this time. Still, as days stretched into weeks, Walt couldn't ignore what others were whispering. That something had happened. That someone had done something. By the third week, suspicion crept in like fog. People who had lived side by side for decades, began locking their doors. Eyes lingered longer on unfamiliar trucks. One man, a local recluse named Frank Leland, was quietly questioned by police after someone claimed to have seen him near the trail on the day Caleb vanished. Frank had lived alone in a small crumbling cottage behind the marsh. He was a Vietnam veteran, with old tattoos and a limp. He rarely spoke. Children were told to avoid his house, but the investigation turned up nothing. No evidence, no history of misconduct. Frank, for all his strangeness, was simply odd, not dangerous. Still, the damage was done. Rumors filled the void where answers should have been. People looked over their shoulders. Families cut beach trips short. In July, a psychic from New Jersey contacted the Rooker family, claiming to have felt Caleb's spirit in a place with water and red stones. Donna, desperate, followed the tip. She and Walt drove 3 counties west, searching a wooded creek bed near a defunct quarry. Nothing. August came, then September. The flyers began to curl and fade. The school held a candlelight vigil where Caleb's desk sat empty, his name still taped to the front. The town tried to return to normal, but normal had changed. Donna refused to move. The house remained untouched. Caleb's room stayed as it was, the yellow comforter pulled tight, the shelves lined with plastic animal figurines and old sea glass he had collected. Each morning, Donna walked the beach. She carried binoculars and a notebook, cataloging birds and weather patterns. It was how she coped. In October, she found something. It was just past the inlet, where the dunes rose higher and the sand became pale and fine. A shoe, child-sized, with a faded green stripe. She knew it instantly. She didn't scream. She didn't fall to her knees. She picked it up and carried it home. Donna Rooker brought the shoe home in silence. She placed it on the kitchen table, next to the morning newspaper she hadn't opened, and a cold cup of coffee she hadn't touched. It looked so small sitting there, like a memory rather than a thing. She sat down across from it, and just stared. She didn't call the sheriff right away. Instead, she went to the linen closet, and pulled out a shoebox marked Caleb outgrown. Inside were old socks, a toy compass, a few kindergarten art projects, and the other shoe, a match. Same faded green stripe, same wear pattern on the toe, same tiny smudge of paint on the heel, from when Caleb had helped her repaint the porch the summer before. There was no doubt. It was his. And still, somehow, it didn't make anything clearer. Only more jagged, more unfinished. When she finally did call Sheriff Evers, he came alone. No deputies, no tape, no press, just a single camera tucked in a plastic evidence bag, and his old Ford parked in the gravel. He held the shoe with gloved hands, examined the stitching, the rubber sole, the faded label. "Where exactly did you find it?" he asked. Donna led him past the boardwalk and into the dunes. The wind was stronger that day, whipping across the tall grass and sending gulls shrieking into the sky. She walked the path carefully, as if retracing Caleb's steps might summon him back. Sheriff Evers followed silently. They reached the spot just past the inlet. Nothing marked it except for a few broken reeds and a shell crushed into the sand. "Right here," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. Evers nodded and made a note in his pad. He crouched, sifted the sand between his fingers, scanned the brush with narrowed eyes. "Could have washed up," he muttered. "It was dry," Donna said. Evers looked up at her. "It was under the grass," she clarified. "It wasn't damp. It hadn't floated here. It was placed." That word lingered. Placed. Not dropped. Not blown. Placed. The search resumed the next day, smaller and quieter this time. No cameras, no volunteers. Just deputies combing the sand and brush, hoping to find a sock, a thread, anything. They found nothing. No tracks, no clothing, no disturbed nests. Just more silence. Evers sent the shoe to the lab in Richmond, hoping for trace evidence, soil samples, fiber comparison, maybe even a latent print. But days passed, then weeks. The lab returned little. No blood, no DNA,
Just one long blonde hair that matched Caleb's from the original samples. It was something, and it was also nothing. The town took it harder than they let on. For the first time in years, people didn't decorate for Halloween. No pumpkins, no hay bales, no kids in costume. The only porch light still on was Donna's. Winter rolled in early that year, bringing sharp winds and frost to the corners of windows. Caleb's absence became a part of the landscape, like the tides or the shifting sand. People stopped mentioning him aloud, but thought of him all the time, in the empty swing at the park, the quiet library corner, where he once sat with bird books, the turtle nests that went unwatched. One man, however, never stopped asking questions. Nate Boland was 23, fresh out of Old Dominion University, with a journalism degree and nowhere to put it. He had grown up in Sandbridge Hollow, the son of a fisherman and a substitute teacher. He remembered Caleb, barefoot and quiet, always with a stick in hand, or a crab in his pocket. After graduating, Nate had come home to save money and regroup. He took a job stocking at the general store, spent nights reading old newspapers, and gradually became fixated on the case. He wasn't the only one with theories, but he was the only one writing them down. In early December, he launched a blog, Hollow Echoes. It started small, just retellings of facts from local articles, timelines, interviews with neighbors, but his posts were careful, thoughtful, and empathetic. He never sensationalized. He only asked. One post read, "If someone took Caleb, they didn't drive far." The Rookers lived at the very end of Sandglass Drive. One road in, one road out. No neighbors reported cars. That means the person either lived here or was walking. Another noted, the shoe was found 4 months after the disappearance, in an area that had already been searched. That means it wasn't there in June, it was placed later. Which begs the question, who wanted it found? The blog gained quiet traction, first among townspeople, then among others in nearby counties. It caught the attention of a woman named Rachel Ames, a retired missing persons investigator, who had worked cold cases for nearly 3 decades. She reached out to Nate directly. They began emailing back and forth. Rachel had never been to Sandbridge Hollow, but she understood rural disappearances. She read everything Nate sent, every report, every police log. Her comments were always measured. In January, she sent this re-examine his social circles. Solitary children don't always wander alone. Sometimes they trust someone others overlook. Nate printed that sentence and taped it above his desk. He started interviewing Caleb's old classmates, now teenagers. Many had moved, but some remained. They remembered him as shy, yes, but kind. He didn't make enemies. He once stood up for a girl being bullied in science class. He brought feathers to show and tell. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. But one name came up more than once, Jordan Pike. He'd been 12 that year, older, louder, and often in trouble. He lived 2 blocks over, in a trailer with his older brother and alcoholic father. Teachers described him as unfocused and aggressive. He'd once been suspended for bringing a switchblade to school, though it turned out to be a fishing knife. Nate remembered Jordan too. He remembered hearing that Caleb had once gone to his house to see a snake Jordan had caught, just once. No one saw him there again. It was a long shot, but Nate dug deeper. Jordan had left town shortly after high school. No college, no social media. He'd enlisted in the army, served a tour, and then disappeared into life somewhere out west. Nate couldn't find much beyond a mugshot from a 2016 bars fight in Idaho and a traffic citation in Nevada. But then he stumbled upon something unexpected. While browsing old police logs, Nate found an incident report from June 2nd, 1992, 4 days before Caleb vanished. A call had been made to the sheriff's office. A woman had reported hearing shouting behind her home, near the marsh trail. She thought it was kids fighting. No follow-up was recorded. The address? 3 houses down from where Caleb's bike had been found. Nate took the report to Sheriff Evers. The sheriff was older now, grayer, slower to react. He squinted at the printout, then rubbed his forehead. "We talked to everyone on that block," he said quietly. "But you didn't follow up on this specific call," Nate pressed. "There was nothing to go on," Evers muttered. He folded the paper and placed it in a drawer. That night, Nate posted a new blog entry titled "The Marsh Trail Incident." He didn't name Jordan, but he laid out the timeline, the proximity, the strange silence around a potential lead. The next morning, someone slipped an envelope under the general store's door. Inside was a single photograph. A grainy shot of two boys, one taller than the other, standing beside an old boat ramp. The taller boy had a snake in his hands. On the back, written in pencil, were 3 words: June 4th, 1992. The photograph of the 2 boys caused a shift. Not a tremor, not a quake, but something subtle and enduring, like the tide pulling just a little harder than expected. Nate Boland stared at it for a long time, seated alone at the table in his apartment above the old pharmacy. He turned it over again and again. There was no envelope, no note beyond the penciled date, no name, just the image. The shorter boy was unmistakable. Caleb Rooker, stringy blonde hair, the hint of a smile. He was looking not at the camera, but at the snake. The taller boy was angled away, caught mid-motion. Just a sliver of his face, but enough. Nate had seen that face before. A little older, a little harder. In a mugshot, 5 years past. Jordan Pike. The date written on the back, June 4th, 1992, was the day Caleb vanished. Nate's mind spun through possibilities. Who had taken the photo? Why had it been kept? Why now, 33 years later, had it surfaced? The boat ramp where the picture was taken still existed, just offshore Pine Road, where the marsh gave way to brackish water. It had long since been abandoned, the docks collapsing into the reeds. Teenagers sometimes gathered there in the summer, but it was mostly forgotten. He went there the next day. Fog hung low across the marsh, thick enough to blur the line between water and sky. The ramp was as he remembered. Splintered boards, rusted metal, grass pushing up through the cracks. The water beyond it was still, reflective like glass. Nate stood there for a while, holding the photo. The silence was immense. He snapped a few shots with his camera, noting angles, trying to match the background in the old photograph to the present. The trees had thickened, but the horizon line remained the same. A bent cypress, a crumbling piling, all still there. He wondered if this was the last place Caleb had been seen alive. That afternoon, he scanned the photo and posted a carefully worded entry on Hollow Echoes titled "The Forgotten Doc." He blurred Jordan's face. He didn't name names. Instead, he asked the public, "Do you know who took this photo?" By the next morning, the post had over 600 shares. 2 days later, he got a reply. It was an email. The sender used an address that meant nothing, sandglass93@protonmail.com. No name, the message was short. "I took that photo. It was an accident. I didn't realize what I had until later. I still don't know what I saw. They were arguing, then they weren't. I left before it got bad. Please don't try to find me. It's not safe." Nate read the message 10 times. The words felt real, rushed, honest, and unsettling. What did "before it got bad" mean? Had something happened right after the photo was taken? If so, why had the witness waited over 3 decades? He forwarded the message to Rachel Ems, the retired investigator he'd been corresponding with. Within hours, she called him. "Nate," she said, her voice crackling slightly through his phone speaker. "This is the first real movement in the case. You understand that?" "I do. You also understand this person is afraid. Whoever they are, they saw something. Maybe more than they're admitting. Do you think I should post the email?" There was a pause. "No," she said finally. "Not yet. Give them space. See if they reach out again. If you push too hard, they'll vanish." So Nate waited. He didn't respond, didn't post anything new for 3 days. Then on the 4th, another message arrived. He used to talk about going away. The little one said something about flying. Like birds do. I think he really believed he could. That day the tall one said he knew a secret. I think that's why the boy followed him. Don't ask me more. I'm not well. But I remember that. Nate read the message slowly, then printed it out, and placed it beside the photo on his desk. Birds, flying, secrets. It echoed things people had said about Caleb. His fascination with birds, his quiet way of dreaming out loud. He'd once told a teacher he wished he were a heron so he could fly away from the noise. Nate tried to imagine what a child like that might do if someone offered him a secret, a mystery, a chance to escape, even just for an afternoon. He began retracing every known movement from that day. June 4th, 1992. The last morning Caleb was seen alive. He built a new timeline, more detailed than ever before. 7:45 a.m., breakfast with his mother. Toast, apple juice. She left for work at 8:15, 8:30 a.m. Caleb left home. No school that day. It was the start of summer break. 8:50 a.m. His bike was seen by Mr. Hale, the grocer, leaning against a pole by the edge of the marsh path. 9:10 a.m. A woman reported children arguing near her back fence, believed to be boys. No follow-up. Then nothing. Silence from 9/11 onward. If the photo was truly taken that day, and every detail suggested it was, then Caleb was still alive at least 30 minutes after the last confirmed sighting of his bike. Sheriff Evers remained guarded when Nate presented the timeline. It's too old, he said. The leads are thin, no way to track that email. Could be a hoax. You saw the shoe, Nate said quietly. That wasn't a hoax. The sheriff didn't respond. A week passed, then two. The holidays came and went. Christmas in Sandbridge Hollow was subdued again. No snow, just cold wind and salted streets. Donna Rooker kept her porch light on. In mid-January, something changed. Nate received a package, no return address, just his name, written in careful cursive on the front. Inside was a VHS tape, old and dusty. Labeled June 92, Cal in red ink. He borrowed a player from the library archives and set it up in his living room. The footage began with shaky shots of the beach, typical family stuff. Children playing in the surf, a sandcastle, then a shift, a handheld pan across the marsh trail, a close-up of a small turtle, laughter off camera, then a voice, Caleb, look here. The camera turned quickly. There he was, Caleb, shirtless, muddy, smiling. A boy's voice followed. He's gonna fly. More laughter. The camera moved again. A blurry figure standing at the edge of a low wooden dock, Caleb, arms outstretched. I'm a bird, he shouted. The video jumped. Static, then another shot. Caleb sitting on the dock, talking to someone just off frame. The voice returned. Tell him about the hole. More static. Then too briefly, a flash of something else. A shallow depression in the sand, behind the marsh, half-covered boards. Caleb's voice, down there. Then the tape ended. Nate sat back, stunned. He rewound it and played it again, this time capturing frames on his phone. A hole. A hiding spot. Something dug into the earth. The dock was easy to identify. It was the same one from the earlier photograph. He went there that afternoon. The area had changed, but not entirely. Brush had grown in, reeds stretched taller, but the dock remained. And after an hour of searching, he found it. A patch of earth, long since covered in moss and fallen leaves, was softer than the rest. He dropped to his knees, pulled back the brush. There were boards. Old, rotted. Nails rusted. He pried one up, then another. Beneath them darkness. A hole, maybe 4 feet deep. Lined with stone, empty, a hiding place. A grave. He called Sheriff Evers immediately. The sheriff arrived within the hour, along with 2 deputies and a forensic team from Norfolk. They photographed everything, marked the area, carefully excavated the shallow pit. There were no remains, no clothing, but there was something else. Buried beneath the last board was a small metal box. Inside, a bundle of twine, a rusted key and a Polaroid. The photo showed Caleb, smiling again. Same doc, same shirt. But this time, he was alone. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, was another figure. Watching, they examined the Polaroid carefully, first in daylight, then under forensic light. The image quality was grainy and aged, the edges curled with time. But the details, once you knew what to look for, were unmistakable. Caleb stood on the dock, facing the camera. In the background, partly obscured by cattails and shadow, stood another figure. Just the outline, a silhouette, like something half caught between presence and memory. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The head turned slightly. The shoulder stooped. Watching, Nate stared at the photo, long after the investigators had finished with it. This was staged, said Sheriff Evers, standing beside him. It was hidden on purpose. That box wasn't just tossed away, it was placed like it mattered. Then the person who buried it wanted someone to find it. Nate replied. Evers nodded. Eventually, the Polaroid was examined for fingerprints, but the surface had degraded too much over the years. The photo, key and twine were catalogued and placed in evidence. For now, their only real value was symbolic, a breadcrumb, suggesting something deeper still buried. The key, though, was promising. An old skeleton-style cut. Small and narrow, not for a house or car. It looked like something used for a trunk. A lockbox. Possibly a storage unit. Nate turned to the Sandbridge Town Registry. There, in a dusty 1991 entry, was a line about a private storage rental off Backwater Lane. A short-term rental paid in cash, 6 months, non-renewable. The box had been registered under a fake name, Eli Sand. But the signature, barely legible, was something else. J. Pike. Nate's heart pounded. Jordan Pike. He remembered the mugshot. The long face, narrow nose. Arrested for petty theft in 1998. Brief jail stint. Then nothing. Jordan had never resurfaced in Sandbridge after his teenage years. Some said he went to South Carolina. Others believed he died in a boating accident. A few locals, those who believed the darker whispers, thought he was still out there, watching from somewhere further along the marsh. The old storage unit was still standing, its metal siding rusted to a dull grey. It was part of a defunct row of 6 units behind an abandoned mechanics lot, overgrown. Vines climbing up the doors. The property had been foreclosed years ago, and never reclaimed. Unit #4 bore a lock so rusted, it cracked open with a single crowbar pull. The door groaned as Nate pulled it upward. Inside, dust swirled in the cold light. The unit was nearly empty, just a plastic milk crate, filled with folders, a warped camping chair, and in the back, a green metal footlocker, with a small lock, matching the shape of the key. Nate crouched, slid the key into the lock, turned. It clicked open with a soft pop. Inside were papers, old, yellowed, and a few objects, a Swiss Army knife, a bird guide, with Caleb's name, penciled inside, and a series of hand-drawn maps on notebook paper. The maps showed areas around Sandbridge, the dock, the marsh path, even the Rooker family's backyard. Others were more precise, like the kind a teenager might make when charting something secret. Then Nate found the notebook. It was a standard composition book, the kind given out in schools. Its cover was cracked, the pages warped from moisture. But the contents were legible. The handwriting belonged to someone young, maybe 14, maybe 15. The first entry was dated May 9th, 1992. He's weird. Always staring at birds. I don't get it. But he listens to me. He says I'm funny. He asked if I knew how wings worked. I said no. He said maybe we could figure it out. Another entry, from May 19th. He told me his dad used to yell. He doesn't like being inside. I get that. He's quiet, but he watches everything. I think he knows more than he says. I told him about the hideout. He said that was cool. Then June 2nd. I think I messed up. I told him something I wasn't supposed to. He asked if people could live underground. I said yes. Then he said, what if we just didn't go back? I laughed. But I don't think he was joking. And then June 4th, he was waiting at the dock. We talked about birds again. He said he could hear them even when no one else could. I told him I had something to show him. I think he liked it. He didn't say much, but he followed. He said it was dark, but not scary. I gave him the sandwich. He asked if he could stay there. I didn't answer. When I came back, he was gone. I didn't tell anyone. The last line was underlined. I didn't tell anyone. Nate sat back, chilled. It wasn't a confession. Not quite. But it was something closer to a long-held secret, slipping loose. Jordan hadn't killed Caleb. Not intentionally, at least. But he'd taken him to that pit, that hideout, under the dock, and then left him there. Why? Why leave a child there alone? Unless Caleb had wanted it. Unless he'd asked to stay. The realization was unbearable. Nate thought of the boy's fascination with birds. His quiet nature. His wish to disappear into something greater than the world he lived in. The notebooks. The old tape. The way he said he wanted to fly. Maybe the marsh had called to him, and he'd listened. Or maybe he'd just been waiting too long for someone to come back. When Nate published the final Hollow Echoes entry, he didn't name Jordan Pike directly. He referred to him only as the friend. He included pieces of the journal, scanned pages, quotes and photos of the maps. He included the Polaroid, with the figure blurred out. The entry was titled, "What We Leave in the Marsh." It went viral. Thousands of people read it. Some sent emails. Others wrote their own memories. A few claimed they had seen Caleb that summer, walking along the edge of the tide, following a heron, whispering to the air. The Rooker family was informed. Donna read the journal pages with trembling hands. "I always wondered," she said, barely above a whisper. "I thought maybe he just ran. But it wasn't that, was it? He trusted someone." She didn't cry. Not in front of Nate. She just sat there quietly, turning the pages of her son's last days, the words of another boy, the only echo left behind. Sheriff Evers ordered one final search of the marsh, focusing on the perimeter around the dock and the hideout. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Forensic teams combed the mud, the roots, the reeds. In February, a fragment of a child's shirt was recovered, matching a photo of Caleb taken 3 days before his disappearance. Nothing else was found. No bones, no remains, just fabric, frayed and faded, caught in the roots of a willow. In March, the dock was officially closed off, and a memorial stone was placed at the edge of the water. It bore Caleb's name, his birth date, and one short phrase beneath. He listened to the birds. The case was never formally closed. There was no body, no final proof, but for the first time in decades, there was a kind of peace. The town began to sleep easier. The porch light at the Rooker house stayed on, but its brightness felt different. Less a beacon for the lost, more a tribute to the remembered.
And Nate, he kept writing. The hollow echoes grew. More cold cases, more missing pieces. But The Boy from Sandbridge Hollow remained its most read story. People still asked questions. Some still speculated, but most just thanked him for giving Caleb a voice, for giving silence a shape. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick across the marsh, they say you can still hear something, soft footsteps on wet boards, the flutter of wings, a child's voice laughing through the reeds. Or maybe it's just the birds, calling someone home. The town of Elmridge sat quietly, tucked away amid dense woodlands and winding country roads. It was the sort of place where life moved at an unhurried pace, where neighbors knew one another by name, and where the rhythm of the seasons marked time more reliably than the clock on the courthouse wall. A small town with a modest population, Elmridge was the kind of place that many people imagined as a refuge from the hurried, chaotic world beyond its borders. In the autumn of 1998, however, the calm of Elmridge was shattered by an event that none could have foreseen. a disappearance that would haunt the town for years to come. Lily Cartwright was 16 years old. To many in Elmridge, she was the embodiment of quiet grace and gentle kindness. She wasn't someone who demanded attention, rather she moved through her days with a thoughtful presence, always attentive but reserved. Friends described her as a listener, someone who noticed the little things, a crack in the sidewalk, the way the wind rustled the leaves, and who rarely spoke unless she had something meaningful to say. Lily's life was simple but full in its own way. She attended Elmridge High School, where she was an average student, neither struggling nor excelling dramatically. Her interests included reading, art, and the occasional afternoon walk along the wooded trails near her home. She loved nature, the quiet spaces where she could think and breathe away from the noise of the world. On a Monday afternoon in early October, Lily left school with plans to meet a friend at the library to study for an upcoming math exam. It was a day like many others, cool and crisp, the kind of weather that smelled of earth and falling leaves. That evening, however, Lily did not return home. Her parents, Ellen and Joe Cartwright, grew concerned as the hours passed. At first they assumed she might have stayed later at the library, or perhaps decided to visit a friend. But when night fell, and there was still no sign of Lily, worry began to take root. By the next morning, with no calls or messages from their daughter, the Cartwrights reached out to the police. The initial response was calm but thorough. Officers canvassed the school, checked with friends and neighbors, and organized search parties to comb the nearby woods. The town's reaction was swift and heartfelt. Volunteers from every corner of Elmridge joined in the search, combing trails, calling Lily's name into the silent trees, and keeping watch for any sign of her. Flyers bearing her photograph, a smiling, serene face framed by light brown hair, appeared on telephone poles, store windows, and bulletin boards. Despite the community's best efforts, days slipped by with no trace of Lily. The hope that she might have simply wandered off and would soon be found began to wane. Each passing hour carried a growing weight, an oppressive uncertainty that clung to the town like morning mist. Detective John Ramirez was assigned to the case. A man in his mid-40s, Ramirez was known for his steady temperament and meticulous approach. He was not the sort to jump to conclusions or succumb to public pressure. Instead, he listened carefully, gathered facts, and sought patterns. From the beginning, Ramirez understood that this investigation was not just about finding a missing girl, but about navigating the delicate emotional landscape of a grieving family and a shaken community. His team started with Lily's last known movements. The library where she had planned to study was quiet, its patrons cooperative. Yet no one had seen her arrive or leave that afternoon. It was as if she had vanished between the moments of ordinary life. One clue emerged from a local convenience store. A clerk recalled Lily purchasing a bottle of water around the time she was supposed to meet her friend. It was a small detail, but important. It suggested that Lily had left school and was moving about town after classes ended. Another lead came from a young teenager who said he had seen a car parked near the edge of the woods at a time that roughly matched Lily's disappearance. The car was unfamiliar, dark-colored, and the driver's face was not recognized. Detective Ramirez carefully mapped these observations, trying to weave them into a coherent timeline. It was a painstaking process, slowed by gaps in memory and the natural confusion of uncertain witnesses. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on Lily's family was profound. Ellen and Joe Cartwright found themselves trapped in a liminal space, caught between hope and despair, between the need to act and the paralyzing weight of not knowing. Ellen stayed awake for nights on end, scrolling through memories and photographs, replaying conversations in her mind, searching for signs she might have missed. Joe retreated into quiet contemplation, his grief expressed more in silence than in words. Their home became a shrine of absence. Lily's belongings, the worn sneakers by the door, her favorite books, the sketch pads filled with delicate drawings, sat untouched. Each item was a fragment of a life frozen in time. As days stretched into weeks, the community's initial optimism was replaced by a more somber understanding. Elmridge was no longer a town insulated from tragedy. The disappearance had peeled back a layer of innocence, exposing the fragile vulnerability beneath. Detective Ramirez kept a careful balance between urgency and patience. He understood that rushing could lead to mistakes, yet every moment without answers felt like a loss. The investigation took an unexpected turn when the Cartwright family received a series of anonymous letters. Each letter was typewritten, carefully worded, and filled with cryptic warnings. They spoke of things better left in the woods and urged the family to cease their search. The letters were haunting, not merely threats, but strangely poetic messages that suggested the sender was watching closely, controlling the narrative from the shadows. These letters introduced a chilling new element. Who was behind them? What did they mean? And why choose such a haunting, indirect way to communicate? The arrival of the letters deepened the mystery and the fear. It suggested a mind both calculated and tormented, someone embedded in the community or intimately familiar with its rhythms. Detective Ramirez expanded the investigation, consulting handwriting and linguistic experts, while also exploring the possibility of local suspects. The tone of the letters implied an insider, someone who knew the forest trails, the town's quiet corners, and perhaps the vulnerabilities of a young girl like Lily. The woods themselves seemed to grow heavier in meaning. What had once been a place of comfort and escape for Lily now felt ominous, a boundary between the known and the unknowable. For the town of Elmridge, the disappearance of Lily Cartwright was more than a missing person case. It was a wound that touched everyone, a reminder that beneath the surface of calm could lie shadows no one was prepared to face. Detective Ramirez stood on the edge of the investigation, aware that each lead might bring relief or heartbreak. The case was no longer just about finding a girl, but about understanding the fragile threads that hold a community together, and what happens when those threads begin to unravel. The following weeks in Elmridge stretched like a slow, aching tide, each day washing over the town with a mixture of hope and despair. Search parties continued their efforts, but the dense woods, with their towering pines and thick underbrush, seemed to swallow every sound and footprint, making it nearly impossible to find any concrete trace of Lily. Detective Ramirez and his team worked tirelessly, their hours stretching late into the night. Every lead was followed with careful attention. They interviewed everyone connected to Lily, classmates, teachers, neighbors, and friends, trying to piece together the last hours before her disappearance. Yet with each conversation, it became clear how little anyone really knew. Lily's best friend, Emily Dawson, spoke quietly of their last meeting. They had planned to study at the library after school. Emily had arrived late and saw Lily sitting alone by the large window, reading a book. She waved, but Lily didn't seem to notice. She looked tired, Emily recalled, like she had a lot on her mind, but she smiled when I caught her eye. Emily's description was a subtle hint at a hidden weight Lily was carrying, something she did not share with her closest friends. There were no indications of trouble at home. The Cartwrights were described as loving and supportive, though private. Yet sometimes silence spoke louder than words. Another student, Marcus Fields, remembered Lily mentioning a new boy who had recently moved to town, someone who kept to himself and often wandered near the woods. Marcus wasn't sure of the boy's name, only that Lily seemed uneasy about him. Detective Ramirez decided to investigate this lead. A search of the town records revealed a recent arrival named Thomas Beckett. Beckett was 17, having moved with his mother from a neighboring county. There was little information about him in Elmridge, no school records, no social connections. Rumors among students whispered of his strange behavior and occasional outbursts. Ramirez arranged to meet with Beckett. When the detective found him at his mother's modest home on the edge of town, Thomas appeared guarded but cooperative. He spoke softly, avoiding eye contact at first. When pressed about Lily, he said they had crossed paths a few times near the wooded trails, but insisted he did not know much about her. "There's a lot of rumors," Thomas said quietly. "People say things about me that aren't true. I don't want to get involved in all this."
His reluctance only deepened Ramirez's curiosity. The detective sensed that Thomas was both a part of the town's undercurrent and perhaps a victim of it. But without evidence, it was impossible to hold suspicion. As the investigation expanded, the physical search for Lily became more organized. The community rallied, sending volunteers into every corner of the forest, even after the first frost dusted the ground with a thin layer of white. Search dogs sniffed at every tree root, rescue teams employed infrared cameras, and helicopters hovered above, their spotlights cutting through the dusk. Despite all these efforts, there was no sign of Lily. The Cartwrights, meanwhile, found themselves increasingly isolated in their grief. Friends tried to offer support, but few could understand the profound emptiness that consumed them. Ellen took to writing daily journals, filling pages with memories and hopes, trying to keep Lily's presence alive through words. Joe focused on practical tasks, organizing search parties and coordinating with law enforcement, a way to channel his anguish into action. The media soon caught wind of the story. Reporters arrived from nearby cities, their cameras and microphones intruding on the fragile privacy of the Cartwright home. Headlines described the disappearance with varying degrees of accuracy and sensitivity, sometimes bordering on speculation. This unwanted attention added to the family's burden. Ellen and Joe found themselves retreating further into themselves, wary of the world beyond their doorstep. Yet amid the turmoil, small acts of kindness offered brief respite. Neighbors brought meals, community members left flowers at the town square, and the local church held candlelight vigils. These gestures wove a fragile thread of hope, reminding the Cartwrights that they were not alone. Detective Ramirez, ever methodical, revisited the anonymous letters sent to the Cartwright family. Each was carefully analyzed for fingerprints and DNA, but the forensics yielded no conclusive results. Linguistic experts noted the phrasing was peculiar, sometimes archaic, almost poetic, which suggested the writer had some education or literary interest. One letter stood out in particular. It was sent nearly 2 weeks after Lily's disappearance, and contained a folded piece of fabric, dark and rough to the touch. Ramirez's team examined it for clues. It was old and worn, perhaps torn from a jacket or bag. The fabric smelled faintly of earth and smoke. This mysterious token deepened the sense of foreboding. Who would send such a message, and what was its meaning? Was it a warning, a taunt, or a plea? As the investigation continued, Ramirez received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Sarah Milton. She was a forest ranger who had been patrolling the outskirts of Elmridge when she noticed signs of recent disturbance deep within the woods. Sarah described a small clearing, partially hidden by overgrowth, where the earth appeared freshly turned. There were remnants of what looked like a makeshift campsite, charred wood from a small fire, scattered food wrappers, and a scrap of cloth similar in texture to the one sent in the letter. Ramirez arranged a search of the area, with the help of Sarah and the local sheriff's office. The site was remote, accessible only by narrow trails that meandered through dense brush. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp soil. At the clearing, investigators found traces that confirmed human presence, but no sign of Lily herself. There were pieces of broken glass, a discarded water bottle, and faint footprints pressed into the soft earth. The footprints were too small for an adult, consistent with a teenager's size. More perplexing was a collection of items left scattered around the camp, an old notebook filled with illegible scribbles, a small battered flashlight, and a faded photograph of a young girl who did not resemble Lily. The photograph sparked new questions. Who was the girl? Was she connected to the campsite? Had someone else been there recently? Detective Ramirez felt the investigation had taken a darker turn. The woods, once simply a backdrop to the town's quiet life, now seemed to conceal secrets too heavy to bear. Back in town, whispers circulated about the campsite and the photograph. Some speculated that Lily had been taken there. Others feared the worst, that someone had been hiding in the woods for a long time. Rumors grew louder, fueled by fear and uncertainty. In the midst of this, the town's collective anxiety began to affect daily life. Parents grew wary of letting their children wander freely. Schools increased security measures. Even the simplest routines, grocery shopping, attending church services, felt overshadowed by the unresolved mystery. The police presence became a constant in Elmridge, officers patrolling streets and questioning anyone who seemed out of place. It was a town transformed by absence. One afternoon, Detective Ramirez met again with Thomas Beckett. This time, Thomas appeared more open, his defenses lowered by the growing pressure. "I didn't want to say anything before," he admitted, "but there's something you should know." He spoke of a group of boys who sometimes gathered near the woods. They had spoken of getting even with people they considered outsiders or weak. Though Thomas never participated, he had overheard plans and threats, vague but unsettling. Ramirez recognized the urgency in Thomas's voice. If these boys were connected to Lily's disappearance, it might explain the letters and the campsite. An investigation into the group began quietly, with officers observing their activities and questioning families. Yet no direct link to Lily was immediately uncovered. Meanwhile, Lily's school organized a memorial service. Students, teachers, and townspeople gathered in the gymnasium, a space normally filled with laughter and noise, now hushed and solemn. Speeches recalled Lily's gentle nature, her kindness, and the light she brought to those around her. The community grieved together, sharing tears and silence. For Ellen and Joe Cartwright, the memorial was bittersweet. It was a public acknowledgement of their loss, and an implicit admission that hope was fading. Yet they clung to the belief that Lily might still be found, that the shadows could still be pierced by light. In the days that followed, Detective Ramirez felt the weight of the case pressing upon him. He knew that time was critical. Evidence faded, memories dimmed, and the fragile trail grew colder. But he also knew that the truth, however painful, was essential, for Lily, for her family, and for the town that awaited answers. The forest held its secrets close, its silent depths watching and waiting, and somewhere in the stillness, the story of Lily Cartwright continued to unfold. Days melted into weeks. The chill of early winter deepened, wrapping Elmridge in a quiet, somber embrace. Snow began to fall lightly at first, just a dusting on the branches, a whisper on the grass. Then thicker flakes settled on rooftops and roads, muffling the sounds of the town like a soft blanket. The cold seemed to deepen the silence that had settled over the community since Lily's disappearance. The investigation pressed on, though with each passing day, the threads grew more tangled, more elusive. Detective Ramirez found himself returning often to the dense woods surrounding Elmridge, walking the narrow trails, eyes scanning the undergrowth for any sign, any clue missed before. One grey afternoon, as he trailed along a seldom-used path near the campsite, Sarah Milton had discovered, Ramirez's attention caught on a faint disturbance in the snow. Footprints, too faint to be immediately clear, but definitely there, pressed into the white surface, leading away from the clearing deeper into the forest. He followed slowly, careful not to destroy what evidence remained. The footprints were small, uneven, and inconsistent, as if the person had stumbled or hesitated. The trail wound between trees, crossed a frozen creek, then faded near a rocky outcrop. Ramirez noted the site, and returned with the forensic team. Specialists arrived, photographing and casting the footprints before the snow could obliterate them completely. Though the prints were fragile, they were a thread, something tangible amid the vast uncertainty. Back at the station, analysis confirmed the prints were consistent with a youth's size, probably similar to Lily's age. Yet this did not confirm much. Was it hers? Had she been here recently? Or long ago? The forest was a place where time seemed to stretch and fold, where memories could become as fleeting as footprints in fresh snow. Meanwhile, within the town, subtle changes in daily life marked the unspoken grief. Shops closed earlier, Fewer people lingered in the cafes or on the streets. The usual chatter had grown hushed, replaced by cautious glances and silent questions. Ellen Cartwright tried to maintain some normalcy for her younger son, Peter, who at 8 years old could barely comprehend why his sister had vanished. She read to him from storybooks each night, filling the room with gentle voices and imagined worlds. Yet the absence of Lily's laughter echoed through the house. Joe, too, was changed. The practical man who had once met every challenge with steady hands, now often sat alone, staring out the window, his face etched with exhaustion. His shoulders bore the invisible weight of responsibility, not just for his family, but for the hope of justice. As winter deepened, Ramirez turned his focus again to Thomas Beckett. The teenager had been reluctant at first, but in recent days, he had agreed to speak more candidly. Thomas revealed that the group of boys he had mentioned before, roughly 5 or 6, were known locally as the Ravens. They were a disparate mix, bound by shared isolation, more than friendship, often causing trouble or lurking on the edges of town life. They weren't just troublemakers, Thomas said quietly. There was something darker. They talked about control, about fear. Ramirez pressed for more specifics. Thomas described overhearing conversations where the Ravens discussed sending messages to people who didn't fit in. Some of their threats had been vague, others chillingly direct. This information shed a new light on the anonymous letters sent to the Cartwrights. Perhaps these were warnings, a sinister form of communication meant to torment. Still, no direct evidence connected the boys to Lily's disappearance. Ramirez requested surveillance of the group, interviews with their families, and checks into their whereabouts on the days surrounding Lily's vanishing. One particularly cold evening, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local hunter, Richard Haynes, called the sheriff's office reporting something unusual. While tracking deer near the northern edge of the woods, he had stumbled upon a shallow pit, partially covered by branches and leaves, but now exposed by the thinning snow. When officers arrived, they found the pit roughly 2 feet deep and 4 feet across. Nearby, faint traces of disturbed earth suggested recent activity. Careful excavation revealed fragments of fabric, some matching the rough texture of the cloth sent in the letter, and disturbingly small bones. The forensic team was called in immediately. The discovery sent a shockwave through Elmridge. The community, already fragile, faced the terrifying possibility that the forest concealed more than lost footsteps or secret campsites. Days passed as experts worked to identify the remains. The bones were incomplete and fragmented, but dental records and DNA analysis offered confirmation that chilled the town to its core. The remains belonged to a young female, consistent with Lily's age. The news hit the Cartwright family with a crushing weight. In the silence of their home, Ellen wept freely for the first time in weeks, clutching the small photograph of Lily she kept on her nightstand. Joe sat quietly, the raw reality breaking through the haze of hope and denial. Detective Ramirez, though devastated, understood that this grim confirmation brought a new urgency and clarity to the investigation. With a sense of grim determination, the police redoubled their efforts to uncover who was responsible. The Ravens quickly became the focal point of the inquiry. Under pressure, one of the boys, Jason Miller, finally agreed to speak. Jason's confession was hesitant, fragmented, but revealing. He described a night in early October when a confrontation between the group and Lily escalated. Lily had confronted them about their threats and bullying, courageous but dangerous. According to Jason, the argument grew heated. In the chaos, things spiraled out of control, and Lily was taken deeper into the woods. Jason's words were tinged with regret and fear, but he implicated no single person as the orchestrator. The investigation into the group revealed a toxic mix of adolescent anger, neglect and cruelty that had culminated in tragedy. None of the boys had a history of violent crime, but their collective actions had led to a devastating consequence. The town struggled to process the reality, a community fractured by fear and silence, where youthful recklessness had transformed into unspeakable loss. In the courtroom that followed, families and friends gathered to hear the accounts. The boys faced charges ranging from assault to manslaughter, each testimony weaving together the narrative of that fateful night. Throughout it all, the memory of Lily remained at the center, a bright life extinguished too soon. As the trial closed, the Cartwrights faced a future shadowed by grief, but sustained by the fragile hope that justice, though imperfect, might offer some measure of peace. Elmridge, scarred but resilient, began to heal slowly, each winter sunset a reminder of the fleeting beauty of life and the enduring weight of loss. The winter slowly gave way to the tentative hints of spring, though the air in Elmridge remained crisp, carrying with it a bittersweet mixture of hope and mourning. The town, once bustling with familiar rhythms, felt altered, as though the absence of Lily had shifted the very atmosphere. There were moments when the sun's gentle warmth seemed to push back the shadows of grief, yet the memory of what had happened lingered like a persistent whisper in the trees. The courtroom proceedings had concluded weeks earlier. The verdicts and sentences delivered a fragile form of closure. The boys from the Ravens were sentenced to various terms in juvenile detention, reflecting their ages and the complex nature of their involvement. None had planned a crime of this magnitude, none had seemed capable of envisioning the lasting harm they would inflict. But the law had spoken, and with it the community sought a path forward. For Ellen and Joe Cartwright, the days following the trial were an echo of a journey that no parent should ever face. The world they had known was irrevocably changed. Their home, once filled with laughter and light, was now a quiet refuge where memories and absence intertwined. Ellen often found herself sitting in Lily's room, the walls still adorned with the pale blue paint and the delicate flower decals Lily had chosen herself. The bedspread remained untouched, the stuffed animals carefully arranged on the windowsill. It was a sacred space, a capsule of childhood frozen in time. Her fingers would trace the familiar contours of Lily's drawings pinned to the corkboard, simple sketches of trees, animals, and the faces of friends. Each stroke was a reminder of the vibrant spirit that had once filled this room, a spirit now silent. Joe coped in his own way. He returned to work at the mill, but his heart was not in the steady rhythm of the machines. His colleagues gave him space, understanding that grief was an unspoken burden he carried like a stone in his chest. Late at night, Joe would walk the quiet streets of Elmridge, the only sounds the crunch of snow beneath his boots and the distant calls of owls. He sought solace in the stillness, a place to wrestle with the questions that had no easy answers. What could we have done differently, he wondered. Was there something we missed? The community, too, began to heal, though the scars remained beneath the surface. Parents gathered in hushed conversations, sharing fears and hopes, trying to protect their own children from a world that suddenly seemed less safe. Schools introduced new programs aimed at promoting kindness, inclusion and awareness, lessons born from the harsh reality of Lily's disappearance and death. At the same time, a quiet reckoning took root. The story of the Ravens was not just one of youthful cruelty, but a mirror reflecting deeper issues: neglect, fractured families, the search for belonging. Counselors and social workers became more visible, offering support where it had once been absent. The hope was that no child in Elmridge would ever feel so lost or isolated again. Detective Ramirez remained a constant presence in the town's quiet corners. Though the case was officially closed, he felt the weight of the investigation long after the headlines faded. In conversations with Ellen and Joe, he witnessed their pain and resilience, the complex dance of sorrow and strength. Ramirez often reflected on the fragility of life and the importance of listening, truly listening, to the stories that too often go unheard. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after Lily's disappearance, Ramirez visited the forest where the remains had been found. The trees had begun to bud, tender green shoots promising renewal. He stood by the pit, now covered and marked with a small plaque, a humble memorial to a young life lost. As he gazed through the branches, he allowed himself a moment of quiet remembrance. In the stillness, he thought not only of Lily, but of all the lives touched by this tragedy. The path to healing was not linear or simple. It was a slow unfolding, one that required patience, compassion, and an acknowledgement of pain. Back in Elmridge, the Cartwright family planted a small garden in Lily's memory, beneath a large maple tree in their backyard. They chose flowers that Lily had loved: daisies, lilies, and forget-me-nots. Each morning, Ellen tended the garden carefully, watering the soil and whispering stories to the blooms. To her, this garden was more than a tribute. It was a place of connection, a living reminder that love endures even in absence. Peter, her younger son, began to ask more questions as spring deepened. "Will Lily come home again?" he asked one evening, his voice small and uncertain. Ellen knelt beside him, taking his hands gently. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, "but she is always with us in our hearts, in the stories we share, and in the kindness we show each other." Peter nodded, leaning into his mother's embrace. This gentle understanding, fragile yet profound, was part of the family's slow journey forward. In the town's church, a memorial service was held on the anniversary of Lily's disappearance. People gathered, some with tears, others with quiet smiles, all united in remembrance. The pastor spoke of light and shadow, of loss and hope. The words were simple, but carried the weight of shared grief. Friends of Lily recited poems, and her school teachers spoke of her bright mind and gentle spirit.
The service ended with a moment of silence, broken only by the soft ringing of a bell, its sound drifting through the crisp air like a benediction. Outside, the snow had melted entirely, revealing a landscape transformed by thaw and renewal. Though the pain of loss lingered, so too did the seeds of healing. The story of Lily Cartwright was one of many threads woven into the fabric of Elmridge's history, an enduring reminder of a life cut short, but also of the love and resilience that can follow. In the quiet moments, in the rustling leaves, and in the hearts of those who remembered, Lily's presence remained. Her story, though marked by tragedy, was also a testament to the human spirit's capacity for hope amid sorrow. The world continued turning, seasons passing, and though shadows might fall again, they would be met with the steady light of memory, kindness, and the courage to move forward. The town of Millbrook sat nestled between rolling hills and dense woods in the heart of New England, a place that seemed untouched by time. Its streets, lined with red brick sidewalks and gas lamp posts, were familiar to all who called it home. The rhythm of daily life was slow and steady, marked by the changing seasons and the gentle hum of community. Among its residents was Marissa Green, a young woman whose life was woven deeply into the fabric of Millbrook. Marissa was 28, with soft brown eyes that held quiet strength and a smile that suggested warmth even on the coldest mornings. She worked at the local library, a job that suited her perfectly. Surrounded by books and stories, she found solace in the quiet corners of knowledge. Her days followed a comfortable pattern, mornings spent arranging shelves, afternoons welcoming visitors, evenings walking her golden retriever, Jasper, along the tree-lined river walk. Those walks were a ritual, a way to clear her mind after a day spent in the stillness of the library's walls. Though she was known to be reserved, Marissa was deeply connected to her family and close friends. She had grown up in Millbrook, attending the same schools as many in the town, and her roots ran deep. Her parents, Elaine and Robert Green, lived just a few streets away, in a modest home filled with the scent of baked bread and freshly brewed coffee. Marissa's relationship with her parents was close, marked by quiet dinners and weekend hikes in the nearby state park. Though she never married, she was content in her life, embracing the small joys and the steady comfort of routine. On a chilly October evening in 2017, as twilight settled over Millbrook and the sky faded from soft blue to deep indigo, Marissa left the library later than usual. She had been helping organize a community event, a book drive to support the local school, and the hours slipped away unnoticed. Jasper trotted beside her as she crossed the town square, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and distant laughter from a cafe. She paused for a moment, watching the golden glow of streetlights cast long shadows over the pavement, savoring the calm of the evening. That night, she never returned home. The next morning, her absence was noticed almost immediately. Her parents, expecting her to join them for Sunday breakfast, grew worried when she did not answer her phone or appear at the usual time. Elaine called friends and colleagues, hoping someone had seen Marissa, but no one could say where she had gone. The police were notified, and soon a search was underway. At first, there was little to suggest foul play. No signs of struggle were found at her home, no indications of distress. Her belongings were all in place, including Jasper's leash and a partially packed backpack for a weekend hiking trip she had mentioned. The town rallied to find her. Volunteers combed the nearby woods and riverbanks. Flyers bearing her photo appeared on lampposts and in shop windows. A candlelight vigil was held in the town square, where neighbors gathered, sharing memories and hope. Days turned into weeks. The initial urgency began to wane, replaced by a heavy silence that settled over Millbrook. Police investigations continued, but leads were scarce. Marissa's phone had been switched off shortly after she left the library, and no financial transactions or social media activity had occurred since. What unsettled the community most was the absence of answers. No motive, no witness accounts. Just a disappearance that seemed to absorb light and leave only shadows behind. Her parents endured each day with a fragile resilience, clinging to hope even as fear whispered otherwise. Robert would often sit by the window, staring out at the autumn leaves swirling in the wind, his thoughts adrift. Elaine spent hours scrolling through messages and calls, replaying conversations in her mind, searching for a clue. Marissa's friends recalled her last days, the laughter they shared, the plans they made. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, nothing to hint at the darkness creeping beneath. Among those friends was Jenna, a childhood companion, who had stood by Marissa through years of change. Jenna remembered the sparkle in Marissa's eyes the last time they met, the way she spoke about her upcoming hiking trip and the new book she was reading. Yet there was one detail that had emerged during the early days of the investigation. Marissa had recently reconnected with an old acquaintance, someone from her past whose name brought unease to a few who knew of their history. His name was Daniel Harper. Daniel had grown up in Millbrook alongside Marissa, though their paths had diverged over the years. Known for a quiet intensity and a complicated past, Daniel had left town several years earlier, after a series of incidents that left some in the community wary. He returned quietly, taking up residence in a small apartment on the edge of town, working various odd jobs but maintaining a low profile. What had drawn Marissa back into contact with Daniel remained unclear. Some speculated it was a desire for closure, others believed it might have been curiosity or even compassion. Detective Mark Caldwell was assigned to the case. A seasoned investigator with a calm demeanor and sharp mind, Caldwell approached the investigation with a careful balance of empathy and determination. He spent hours reviewing evidence, interviewing friends, family, and acquaintances. Daniel Harper's name surfaced repeatedly, and Caldwell knew that understanding their connection might be key. One afternoon, Caldwell sat across from Daniel in the sterile interrogation room at the Millbrook Police Department. Daniel was composed, his gaze steady but guarded. "I want to help find Marissa," Daniel said quietly. "I haven't seen her since that night." Caldwell watched him carefully. "Did you and Marissa speak that evening? Did you meet?" Daniel shook his head. "No. We talked earlier that week, but on the night she disappeared, I was home alone. I didn't hear from her." Though Daniel cooperated, the evidence remained elusive. Days later, a break came when a hiker reported finding a small worn backpack deep in the woods about 2 miles from the Riverwalk. It contained some of Marissa's belongings, her wallet, a few personal items, but no sign of her. The location was remote, surrounded by dense trees and rocky terrain. Search teams were dispatched immediately to comb the area, but the deeper they ventured, the more fragmented the clues became. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no indication of struggle. It was as if Marissa had simply vanished. The town's collective heart grew heavier with each passing day. Murmurs of fear and suspicion swirled beneath the surface, questions about who could have done this, if anyone. For Marissa's parents, every night was a battle against despair, every sunrise a reminder of a daughter who should have been home. Yet, amid the darkness, the investigation pressed on. New technologies were brought in, digital records examined, patterns analyzed. But the truth remained tantalizingly out of reach. As the seasons changed, Millbrook learned to live with uncertainty, holding on to the memory of Marissa, the young woman who loved books, walks along the river, and quiet evenings filled with possibility. Her story was far from over, the thread still unraveling slowly in the hands of those who sought answers. The days after the discovery of Marissa's backpack in the woods deepened the mystery surrounding her disappearance. The area where the backpack was found was far enough from the town's familiar paths that it was rarely traveled, an expanse of dense pines, jagged rocks and tangled underbrush. The terrain was rugged, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. For those who lived in Millbrook, it was a place both beautiful and foreboding, a reminder of nature's vastness and the secrets it could conceal. Detective Caldwell and his team intensified their search efforts, combing the woods with a meticulous thoroughness born of growing desperation. They brought in search and rescue dogs, trained to detect human scent, used drones to survey the canopy, and employed ground-penetrating radar to scan the rocky soil. Still, no further trace of Marissa was uncovered. The backpack, now sealed in evidence bags, had been examined carefully. There was no damage to its fabric, no signs of a violent struggle, and no fingerprints other than Marissa's. Inside, there were a few personal items, a small notebook, a pen, a folded map of local hiking trails, and a set of keys. Curiously, the notebook contained nothing but scribbled lines and faint doodles, an indecipherable script that puzzled forensic analysts. The map showed marks indicating a hiking route she had planned, one that led from the riverwalk through the wooded hills and back into town. It was a route she had talked about enthusiastically to friends, one meant to celebrate the arrival of autumn and the changing colors of the leaves. Jenna, Marissa's closest friend, was brought in for a detailed interview. She described Marissa as someone who had recently seemed a bit more introspective, quieter than usual but not withdrawn. They had spoken several times about the hike, and Jenna recalled a fleeting mention of wanting to find something, a place where everything feels clear. Marissa had said. Caldwell listened carefully. Did she mention any concerns? Anyone who might want to harm her? No, Jenna replied softly. If anything, she was looking to escape, to find peace. I didn't think it was anything serious. But peace, it seemed, had become elusive. Daniel Harper remained a figure of interest, though no direct link had yet been established. He cooperated fully with investigators, sharing his movements, providing alibis, and submitting to voluntary searches of his home and vehicle. Nothing incriminating was found, and his statements were consistent. Despite this, the shadow of suspicion lingered. Neighbors recalled seeing Daniel and Marissa in conversation at a local cafe a few days before her disappearance. They seemed engaged but quiet, their expressions guarded. No one overheard what was said, and no messages between them were found on Marissa's phone. Detective Caldwell understood that Daniel represented a fragment of the puzzle, a connection to Marissa's past that might hold clues to the present. But the silence between them was thick, layered with unspoken histories. As the investigation stretched into November, the town's cold settled deep. Mornings brought frost to the fields, and nights grew longer, the dark pressing against windows and doors. The disappearance felt less like an anomaly, and more like a wound in the community's heart. Elaine Green struggled to maintain her composure. She found herself waking in the early hours, the bed cold and empty beside her. The phone would not ring, the door would not open. She spent hours at the kitchen table, clutching a cup of tea as she sifted through photographs and letters, seeking any sign of her daughter's presence. Robert, her father, was quieter. He poured himself into the town's volunteer search efforts, pacing through the woods for hours, sometimes with Jasper at his heels. The dog,
once full of energy, grew somber, his bright eyes dulled by the absence of his companion. A month after the backpack's discovery, a letter arrived at the Millbrook Police Department, postmarked from a neighboring state. The envelope was unmarked except for Marissa's name, written in familiar handwriting. Inside was a note, typed on plain white paper, short and cryptic. "I am safe. Don't look for me here. I needed to disappear. Please understand." The letter sent ripples through the investigation. Was Marissa alive? Had she vanished by choice? Or was this a cruel message from someone seeking to mislead? Detective Caldwell brought the letter to Elaine and Robert, who read it in stunned silence. Elaine's hands trembled, the fragile hope and the aching uncertainty mingling painfully. Caldwell organized a new search effort, focusing on nearby states, contacting law enforcement agencies and hospitals, checking shelters and known safe houses. Social media alerts were issued with Marissa's photo, and private investigators were hired to follow any leads. Meanwhile, the psychological toll on the family and community deepened. The unknown gnawed at them, the absence of answers, the possibility of abandonment, the fear of harm. Marissa's friends spoke of her kindness, her quiet strength, and the way she carried herself through life with dignity. They remembered her laughter during book club meetings, the gentle way she cared for Jasper, and the soft light in her eyes when she spoke about the future. Yet there was a question that lingered in their minds. Had Marissa been running from something? Or was she hiding to protect herself or others? Some suggested she might have been entangled in a secret that weighed heavily on her, something from her past or connected to Daniel Harper's return. Others feared the worst, that she had become a victim of a predator who had watched from the shadows. Daniel's background was examined more closely. As a teenager, he had been involved in minor offenses, vandalism, petty theft, and later struggled with bouts of depression and isolation. His family had fractured, and he had left Millbrook abruptly after an incident that remained undisclosed to the public. Yet those who knew him described a complex man, someone capable of both darkness and kindness. He had sought therapy, tried to rebuild his life quietly, and by all accounts, had been making progress. Could he be trusted? Detective Caldwell wondered if Marissa's reappearance in Daniel's life was a source of comfort or conflict. Had they met to resolve old wounds, or had their reunion ignited something dangerous? One particularly cold morning, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A local farmer, clearing brush near the edge of his property, stumbled upon a weathered piece of fabric caught on a thorny bush. It was a scarf, delicate, embroidered with intricate patterns, one that Marissa was known to wear on walks. He alerted the police, who sent a team to investigate the area. The location was just outside town, near a narrow creek that ran beneath an old stone bridge. The scarf was partially buried in fallen leaves and dirt, its colors faded by exposure. More than the physical evidence, the discovery stirred something intangible, the feeling that the forest itself held stories waiting to be uncovered. Search dogs were brought again, tracing scents and marking paths, but the woods yielded no more than quiet whispers and cold shadows. The investigation now faced a crossroads between hope and despair. Marissa's disappearance had transformed from a missing person case to an unresolved mystery that haunted every corner of Millbrook. The townspeople, once confident in the safety of their community, now locked doors more tightly, watched strangers with wary eyes, and spoke in hushed tones about the woman who had vanished like a fading dream. Elaine Green organized support groups, gathering families of missing persons from nearby counties. They met in church basements and community halls, sharing stories and holding each other through the long nights. Marissa's case became emblematic of the quiet tragedies that often go unnoticed, the lives disrupted, the families fractured, the unanswered questions that linger in the silence. Detective Caldwell, despite the pressure and public scrutiny, remained steadfast. He revisited every lead, questioned every witness anew, and held on to the belief that somewhere, hidden beneath the layers of time and distance, the truth awaited discovery. In moments alone, he would sit at his desk, the dim light casting long shadows, and wonder about the woman behind the case file, the gentle librarian with a dog named Jasper, the daughter who had loved her family, and the woods, the friend who had smiled even when carrying unseen burdens. Was Marissa still out there, navigating a world that had grown dark, or had the woods claimed her in a silence that would never be broken? The mystery lingered, deep and unyielding, a slow, haunting presence in the lives she had touched. The arrival of winter in Millbrook brought with it a cold that seemed to seep not only into the bones, but also into the heart of the town itself. The streets grew quiet, blanketed in snow, muffling the usual sounds of daily life. The familiar rhythms of routine were punctuated by the lingering absence of Marissa Green, whose disappearance had settled over the community like a shadow no sunlight could fully chase away. Detective Caldwell spent long hours in the dim glow of his office lamp, poring over every detail collected thus far. The case file was thickening. Statements, evidence logs, maps, forensic reports, but none of it formed a clear picture. Each lead seemed to thread off into the cold, tangled wilderness that had swallowed Marissa's footsteps. One morning, a breakthrough came in the form of a call from the state police in a neighboring county. They had located a woman fitting Marissa's description, living quietly, under an assumed name in a small town some 100 miles away. She had been found at a homeless shelter, disoriented but unharmed. Caldwell immediately arranged to meet with her. The woman, though hesitant at first, soon revealed herself to be Marissa Green. She was thinner than when last seen, her eyes reflecting months of uncertainty and fear. Her voice was soft but steady, as she explained her absence. "I needed to leave," she said, "to find space away from everything." The details she shared were fragmentary, a tapestry woven with threads of fear and sorrow. She spoke of a man she had known years before, someone who had re-entered her life unexpectedly, and unsettled the fragile peace she had built. The man was Daniel Harper. Marissa recounted their encounter, how Daniel had sought her out, expressing regret for past mistakes, seeking forgiveness. But as time passed, the meetings grew tense, his demeanor shifting unpredictably. She described arguments behind closed doors, moments of intimidation masked by apologies. "I didn't feel safe," she confessed. "I thought I could handle it, but I couldn't." She had fled one night, leaving only a note behind for her family, the brief letter sent to the police a few weeks earlier. She had taken the route through the woods, hoping to vanish from the world that had become suffocating. Caldwell listened without interruption, the weight of her story settling like winter snow in the quiet room. Marissa's reappearance sparked a renewed wave of relief and sorrow for her family and friends. Elaine and Robert traveled immediately to be by her side, their reunion marked by tears and embraces, a fragile light flickering amid months of darkness. Yet, the relief was tempered by the knowledge that Marissa was far from healed. The scars she carried, emotional and psychological, would require time and patience to understand and mend. The police moved quickly to bring Daniel Harper back for questioning. This time, the interviews were more pointed, the atmosphere charged with the gravity of the accusations implied by Marissa's words. Daniel's responses were a mixture of remorse and denial. He admitted to reaching out to Marissa, but insisted that his intentions were to make amends, not to harm. He claimed the disagreements were misunderstandings, the tension exaggerated. Still, Detective Caldwell knew the complexity of such cases. The line between remorse and menace could be thin, and often blurred by years of shared history. The investigation now took on a dual nature: to confirm Marissa's safety, and to uncover the truth behind Daniel's behavior. Counselors and social workers became involved, providing Marissa with support as she began the long journey toward recovery. She moved temporarily to a shelter where she could rebuild her sense of security, away from the prying eyes of the town and the media. The community rallied around her in quiet, heartfelt ways, meals left at the doorstep, letters filled with encouragement, moments of silence at local gatherings. For Marissa, however, the world was still a place of shadows and light, a place where trust had to be carefully earned and boundaries firmly drawn. Detective Caldwell's team continued to gather evidence, reviewing phone records, text messages, and surveillance footage. They found a pattern of contact between Marissa and Daniel in the weeks before her disappearance, often occurring late at night, sometimes abruptly ending. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices from Daniel's home, adding layers to the narrative that Marissa had shared. The complexity of the case deepened further with the involvement of a third party, a man named Marcus Ellison, who had been a friend of Daniel's and occasionally seen around Millbrook. Marcus was known locally as a drifter with a volatile temper, a man whose loyalties were difficult to ascertain. Some believed he had been involved in minor crimes, while others regarded him as a protector of sorts, willing to confront those who threatened his friends. Marissa mentioned Marcus only briefly, recalling an incident where she had seen him watching her during one of Daniel's visits, a cold intensity in his eyes. "Something about him made me uneasy," she said. "I couldn't explain it." Detective Caldwell requested to speak with Marcus, who initially denied any involvement with Marissa or Daniel in recent months. However, under persistent questioning, his story shifted. He admitted to being present during some of the meetings between Marissa and Daniel, but insisted he had no intent to harm anyone. He portrayed himself as a mediator, someone trying to keep peace between the two. Still, his accounts contained inconsistencies that raised suspicion. The investigation widened its scope, weaving a complex tapestry of relationships, motivations, and emotions. The quiet town of Millbrook was no longer just a backdrop, but a living, breathing participant in a story of vulnerability and resilience. Meanwhile, Marissa began to reclaim small parts of her life, spending time with Jasper, the dog who had been her faithful companion, attending therapy sessions, and reconnecting with her family. Her story was one of survival, marked by moments of courage and pain. Yet, the shadows of the past lingered. One evening, a week after her return, Marissa confided in Detective Caldwell that she had found a hidden notebook in Daniel's house during a brief visit. It was filled with scribbled names, dates, and cryptic notes, some referencing Millbrook, others places far beyond. The notebook suggested a network of connections, a web that extended beyond personal disputes, hinting at secrets that neither Marissa nor the investigators had anticipated. Caldwell took possession of the notebook and began to decipher its contents with his team. It revealed a chilling complexity, a tangled web of jealousy, betrayal, and unresolved conflicts. Names of people from the town appeared alongside cryptic references to debts, warnings, and promises broken. The tone of the notes shifted between remorse and menace, suggesting a man wrestling with his own demons, trying to exert control over a world that had slipped from his grasp. As Caldwell read the pages, he felt the weight of the unsaid. This was not merely a story of one woman's disappearance, but a portrait of a fractured community, where past wounds festered beneath the surface. In the days that followed, the police widened their investigation to include several individuals mentioned in the notebook. Interviews uncovered old feuds, hidden resentments, and dark secrets long buried. Some neighbors recalled heated confrontations between Daniel and others in the community, arguments over property, disputes over finances, and whispers of jealousy regarding Marissa's relationships. The atmosphere in Millbrook grew tense once again, as the fragile hope rekindled by Marissa's return collided with the hard realities of the past. Marissa herself was torn between relief and fear. While she felt safe in the presence of her family and Detective Caldwell, the knowledge of the notebook's contents unsettled her. She confided that she feared retaliation, not just from Daniel, but from others whose names were written in those pages. The police increased security around her, and community leaders organized meetings to address the unrest. At the same time, Caldwell was careful to protect the investigation from becoming a witch hunt. He recognized the need for balance, to seek justice without inflaming old wounds or creating new ones. The town, with its tightly knit families and intertwined histories, stood at a crossroads. The slow, haunting journey to uncover the truth had brought pain, but also the possibility of healing. Marissa's story was no longer just about disappearance and fear. It had become a testament to resilience, the strength to face shadows, to reclaim life piece by piece, and to confront the ghosts of the past. In the quiet moments between interviews and evidence review, Caldwell often reflected on the fragility of safety and the hidden struggles people carried beneath the surface. Marissa Green's disappearance, and her return reminded him that beneath the calmest waters often lurked the deepest currents. The investigation continued, unfolding layer by layer, revealing the complexity of human connections and the enduring hope for peace. As winter's grip slowly loosened and the first hints of spring began to stir in Millbrook, the investigation surrounding Marissa Green's disappearance and return entered its final crucial phase. The cold, quiet town had been pulled into the shadows of suspicion and fear, but also into moments of unexpected clarity and connection. The days grew longer, yet the emotional weight of the case remained dense, settling on the community like a slow fog. Detective Caldwell, having spent months navigating the tangled web of relationships, secrets and pain, approached the conclusion of his work with a careful steadiness. There was no rush to judgment, no need to wrap the story in neat bows. Instead, there was a quiet respect for the complexity and humanity woven through the case, for the lives that had been altered, for the truths that had surfaced in uneven, sometimes contradictory fragments. The notebook recovered from Daniel Harper's home had proved to be a pivotal piece of evidence, not because it contained clear confessions or direct admissions of wrongdoing, but because it painted a portrait of a man tormented by his own failures and fears, and by the intricate network of relationships that had, over years, begun to unravel. Among the names listed were several residents of Millbrook, individuals with long-standing connections to Daniel, to Marissa, and to one another. Old business deals, personal betrayals, and past grievances appeared in cryptic shorthand. Some notes hinted at debts owed, promises broken, and threats veiled behind coded language. While the notebook did not provide definitive proof of any crime, it illuminated a landscape of tension and resentment that had quietly simmered beneath the town's placid surface. For Caldwell, the challenge was to distinguish between harmless grievances and matters of true consequence. Interviews with those named revealed a mosaic of stories: a landlord frustrated by missed rent payments, a former friend embittered by a broken partnership, neighbors tangled in disputes over property lines and barking dogs. None confessed to any violent acts, and many expressed shock at the chain of events that had left Marissa vanished for months. Yet one revelation stood apart. A former colleague of Daniel's came forward with information about a confrontation months before Marissa's disappearance. The colleague recounted how Daniel had appeared increasingly unstable, his mood swinging between remorseful and threatening. He spoke of a heated argument, where Daniel had threatened to make things right, no matter the cost, though he did not specify to whom the threat was directed. This testimony reinforced the picture of a man in crisis, but it still left many questions unanswered. Daniel Harper himself, having been held for questioning, was eventually charged, not with abduction or assault, but with harassment and intimidation. The evidence, while circumstantial in some areas, was enough to support these charges. However, the more serious allegations, those concerning Marissa's disappearance and the possible involvement of others, remained unresolved. Marissa, for her part, focused on healing and rebuilding her life. She moved into a small apartment provided by a local non-profit, supported by therapy and the unwavering presence of her family. The trauma she had endured was visible in quiet moments, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the hesitancy with which she re-engaged with the world. Yet there was also strength in her resilience. She volunteered at community centers, sharing her story in measured doses, hoping to offer comfort to others wrestling with fear and loss.
One afternoon, Detective Caldwell visited Marissa at her new home. The room was simple, filled with sunlight and the soft hum of distant traffic. Jasper, the loyal dog who had been her constant companion, lay curled by the window. They spoke quietly, not of the case, but of hope and uncertainty. "I don't know if I'll ever feel safe the way I used to," Marissa said softly, "but I'm learning to trust myself again." Caldwell nodded. "That's what matters most." The broader community, too, began to reflect on the shadows that had passed through their streets. Local leaders organized forums to address mental health, domestic violence, and the importance of support networks. The The case had shaken Millbrook, but it also sparked conversations that might prevent similar stories in the future. Yet, not all wounds were easily healed. Some residents remained wary, their eyes clouded by suspicion. Rumors circulated, fueled by incomplete information and the human need for explanation. The fractures in the community's fabric were subtle but persistent. Detective Caldwell understood this well. The truth of human behavior was often messy and incomplete, marked by shades of grey rather than clear lines of black and white. As spring blossomed fully, Marissa's case was officially closed. The charges against Daniel Harper stood, and he was sentenced to probation with conditions designed to protect Marissa and ensure he received counseling. For many, the end of the legal process marked a beginning, a chance to rebuild, to forgive, or at least to understand. For Marissa, the journey continued on its own, quieter path. She remained cautious but hopeful. She took long walks with Jasper in the town's small park, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the softness of new grass beneath her feet. She reconnected with friends she had once pushed away, weaving new threads into her life's tapestry. And though the mystery of her disappearance was not filled with dramatic twists or clear villains, it was no less profound. It was the story of a woman who had been lost and found, of a community shaken but enduring, of the fragile but persistent light that flickers within each person's story. Detective Caldwell often thought back to the long nights spent tracing footsteps in the snow, to the quiet courage of a woman who had vanished into the woods and returned forever changed. He knew the case would linger in his mind, a reminder of the complexity of safety, trust, and healing. In the end, there were no easy answers, only the slow, deliberate work of understanding, of listening, and of compassion. The story of Marissa Green was a quiet one, marked not by sensational headlines, but by the gentle persistence of hope, the soft resilience of the human spirit, and the unspoken promise that even in the darkest winters, spring eventually arrives. In the summer of 1996, the small town of Maplewood, Pennsylvania, was a place where everyone seemed to know everyone else. The kind of town where children rode their bikes freely down quiet streets, where neighbors stopped to chat on porches, and where the rhythm of daily life followed the slow, steady pulse of familiarity. Maplewood was not a town prone to violence. The local police rarely dealt with anything more serious than petty theft or occasional drunken disputes. Yet, beneath this calm surface, a disturbing story began to unfold, one that would quietly unravel the lives of many and leave a mark on the community that endured long after the headlines faded. At the center of this story was a young woman named Laura Bennett. Laura was 22 years old, a college student who had returned home for the summer break. She lived with her parents in a modest house on Elm Street, a block lined with maples that shaded the sidewalks and scattered golden leaves across the lawns each fall. Laura was known in town for her kindness and her quiet determination. She worked part-time at the local library and was studying to become a teacher. She had plans, dreams, and a gentle warmth that made her well-liked among family and friends. On the evening of July 10, 1996, Laura went out with a small group of friends to celebrate the end of the semester. The group gathered at a nearby park, where they sat around a picnic table beneath tall oaks, sharing stories, laughter, and the easy camaraderie of youth. The night was warm, the stars just beginning to emerge. As the group began to disperse, Laura said her goodbyes and started walking home along the familiar sidewalks, the soft glow of street lamps guiding her path. She never arrived. The next morning, when Laura's parents awoke and found her bedroom empty, concern grew quickly. Phone calls to friends revealed that Laura had left the party alone around 11 p.m., but had not been seen since. Her car was still parked at the library, where she was supposed to work the next day. By midday, the Maplewood Police Department was alerted. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood, asking questions, searching the parks, and checking nearby roads and wooded areas. The initial search yielded no sign of Laura. As hours turned into days, the atmosphere in Maplewood shifted. Anxiety took root. The absence of answers bred rumors, speculation, and fear. Why had Laura disappeared? Had she run away? Was she hurt or trapped somewhere? The community, usually so secure, felt suddenly fragile. Detective Mark Reynolds, a seasoned officer known for his steady approach, was assigned to lead the investigation. Reynolds had grown up near Maplewood and knew the town's rhythms and people well. Yet, this case challenged even his experience. He began by retracing Laura's steps that night, talking to friends, retracing the route home, and examining the area for clues. Laura's friends described her as happy that evening, though perhaps a little distracted. She mentioned a recent disagreement with her boyfriend, but nothing serious enough to suggest she wanted to leave town or harm herself. Her boyfriend, Jason Miller, was questioned thoroughly. He appeared cooperative but reserved, his demeanor a mix of concern and defensiveness. Jason confirmed their argument had been about jealousy, but insisted it was resolved before the party. Detective Reynolds found no immediate evidence of foul play, but something about the case gnawed at him. Laura's disappearance did not fit any simple explanation. Over the next week, searches expanded into the surrounding woods and fields. Volunteers joined police officers, combing through underbrush and abandoned buildings. Flyers with Laura's smiling face were posted in windows and on telephone poles. The town held its breath. Then, nearly 2 weeks after Laura vanished, a break came. A local hunter discovered an abandoned campsite deep in the nearby woods, ashes still warm in the fire pit, a few scattered belongings, including a book inscribed with Laura's name. The discovery intensified the search. Police focused their efforts in that area, hoping it might lead to answers about what had happened to her. Yet, the investigation soon confronted a painful reality. There were no easy answers. As weeks passed, pieces of Laura's story came together slowly and incompletely, painted in shadows and half-truths. Friends revealed that her relationship with Jason had been more troubled than initially disclosed. They spoke quietly of controlling behavior, frequent arguments, and moments of fear. Jason denied any wrongdoing, maintaining his innocence, but his alibi had gaps, and his actions raised questions. His reluctance to fully cooperate, his evasiveness when pressed about the night of July 10th, planted seeds of doubt. Still, the physical evidence was thin. There was no direct proof tying him to Laura's disappearance. Detective Reynolds knew this was a case about more than just facts. It was about human emotions tangled in silence, about the difficult truths people avoid admitting even to themselves. In the absence of concrete leads, the investigation began to probe deeper into Laura's life, her friendships, family dynamics, and her own fears. The more they uncovered, the more complex the picture became. Laura had confided in a close friend about feeling trapped, not only in her relationship, but in her life's circumstances. She dreamed of moving away, of breaking free from expectations and pressures that weighed heavily on her. But she had not told anyone she planned to leave that summer. Her disappearance had been sudden, unexpected. Detective Reynolds and his team searched for anyone who might have seen her after that night, any hint that she had made contact or sought help. Weeks slipped by with no sign. Maplewood settled into an uneasy silence, the kind that stretches thin over days and months. For Laura's family, the waiting was unbearable. Her mother held on to hope while her father wrestled with despair. Friends grappled with guilt and confusion, trying to reconcile the woman they knew with the mystery that had swallowed her. In this small town, the disappearance of one young woman cast a long shadow, one that would linger for years, shaping lives and haunting memories. The days stretched into weeks, the passage of time marked only by the slow changing of seasons. Summer's warmth began to give way to the softer tones of early autumn, and with it came a chill that seemed to seep into the hearts of those who still waited for Laura Bennett's return. Detective Mark Reynolds had spent countless hours reviewing the case, convinced that beneath the surface lay answers yet undiscovered. The abandoned campsite had been an unsettling sign, a place where Laura had perhaps stopped, rested, or been forced to stay, but it offered no direct evidence of what had transpired afterward. As the investigation expanded, so too did the scrutiny of Laura's inner circle. The police spoke again and again with Jason Miller, her boyfriend, whose evasive responses made it difficult to trust his story. He claimed to have been at a friend's house the night Laura disappeared, but his alibi had gaps, and some witnesses reported seeing him near the park later that evening than he admitted. Yet, despite suspicion, no tangible proof tied Jason to any wrongdoing. The police also interviewed Laura's friends from the party. One close friend, Emily, revealed that Laura had seemed increasingly anxious in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She described Laura's unease as a subtle undercurrent, small remarks, fleeting worries, and a sense of being watched. Laura said she felt like someone was following her. Emily recalled, "She didn't want to say who or why, but she seemed scared." These revelations added a layer of complexity that Detective Reynolds could not ignore. If Laura was indeed afraid, then her disappearance might have been an escape, or something far more sinister. With no immediate leads, the police turned to more traditional investigative methods. They revisited the physical evidence gathered from the campsite, sending items for forensic testing. A torn piece of fabric was matched to Laura's jacket, confirming her presence. A set of footprints found nearby suggested someone else had been there, but the soil and weather conditions had degraded the prints too much to identify. Meanwhile, the community organized vigils and fundraisers, hoping to keep Laura's memory alive and to spur any potential witnesses into coming forward. The local newspaper ran feature stories, emphasizing the humanity behind the headlines: a young woman with hopes, fears, and a life interrupted. Laura's parents spoke publicly, pleading for any information, no matter how small. "We just want to know where she is," her mother said, voice trembling. "Please, if you saw anything, please come forward." Among the many who watched the investigation closely was a man named Carl Jensen, a reclusive figure who lived on the outskirts of town. Carl was a woodsman by trade, familiar with the dense forests surrounding Maplewood. He had no connection to Laura, but found himself drawn to the mystery. One afternoon, Carl came forward with a piece of information that would shift the investigation in a new direction. He told the police that about a week after Laura's disappearance, he had noticed unusual activity near an old cabin deep in the woods, a place rarely visited and known locally as a site for discarded trash and forgotten relics. Carl described seeing a man loading what appeared to be heavy bags into a truck late at night. The figure was cloaked in shadow, but Carl believed he recognized the vehicle, a dark green pickup truck he had seen around town before. The police took Carl's account seriously, dispatching officers to investigate the cabin and surrounding area. What they found was unsettling. The cabin was dilapidated, long abandoned, but evidence suggested it had recently been occupied. Inside, there were traces of food, makeshift bedding, and signs someone had tried to stay hidden. Nearby, officers found tire tracks matching the green pickup Carl had described. More importantly, they found discarded items that forensic analysis later revealed bore faint traces of Laura's DNA. Suddenly, the investigation was no longer just about a missing person, it became a case of potential abduction. Detective Reynolds redoubled his efforts, coordinating with neighboring jurisdictions and the state police. The search radius expanded to include a network of abandoned properties, forests, and rural roads. In the days that followed, another troubling discovery surfaced. A local farmer reported finding a shallow grave on his property, near a seldom-used trail in the woods. The police rushed to the scene and began careful excavation. What they uncovered was a set of skeletal remains, partially covered and hidden beneath leaves and soil. Initial forensic examination confirmed that the remains belonged to a young woman, but the identification process was painstaking and slow. Dental records were checked, DNA samples taken, and investigators waited anxiously for confirmation. Meanwhile, the community braced for the worst. The news shattered the fragile hope that had kept Laura's family going. Though they had feared this outcome, hearing it spoken aloud was unbearable. Laura's mother spent days at the hospital, where the forensic team worked. When the final confirmation came, it was both a relief and a devastating blow. Her daughter was gone, but the case was far from over. Now, with a body found, the police intensified their investigation into the circumstances of Laura's death.
Autopsy results revealed signs of trauma consistent with a violent struggle. The nature of the wounds suggested that Laura had fought fiercely, resisting whatever fate had overtaken her. Detective Reynolds considered the psychological implications of this resistance. Laura had been terrified, but had not given up hope. Her fight became a silent testament to her courage. The focus then returned to the suspects. Jason Miller's story unraveled further under pressure. Investigators found inconsistencies in his timeline and discovered he had recently taken out a life insurance policy on Laura, naming himself as the beneficiary. When confronted, Jason's demeanor shifted from cooperative to defensive. He refused to answer further questions without his attorney present, and eventually became a person of interest. Yet without direct evidence linking him to the crime scene, the case remained circumstantial. As the investigation stretched into months, it exposed the darker undercurrents that had been hidden beneath the town's calm veneer. Old friendships fractured, neighbors whispered behind closed doors, and the once close-knit community found itself divided by suspicion and grief. Psychologists brought in to assist the family and friends described the collective trauma as a community wound, one that would require years to heal. For Laura's parents, the pain was unbearable, but also motivating. They became advocates for victims of domestic abuse, speaking openly about the signs they had missed and the warning signs Laura had tried to communicate. Their efforts sparked awareness campaigns throughout Pennsylvania, encouraging others to seek help and speak out. In the end, Laura's story became more than a mystery. It was a reflection of the complexities of human relationships, the quiet struggles many endure, and the devastating consequences when those struggles go unseen. The investigation would continue for years, with small breakthroughs and frustrating dead ends. Detective Reynolds often thought of Laura, not just as a case, but as a young woman full of dreams, hopes, and the promise of a future that was stolen. Her story lingered in the hearts of Maplewood's residents, a reminder of fragility, resilience, and the haunting silence that follows unanswered questions. The days following the grim discovery of Laura Bennett's remains settled heavily over Maplewood, like a dense fog refusing to lift. The town, once bright with late summer vitality, now seemed muted. Shadows lengthened in unexpected places, and the air held a quiet sorrow. For Detective Mark Reynolds, the weight of the case pressed deeper with each passing day. The presence of Laura's body gave a form to the loss, but it also sharpened the urgency to find answers, to understand who had taken her, and why. The autopsy had painted a grim picture. Laura's final moments were marked by violence and terror, yet also by a fierce resistance. There was no indication that this had been a random act. The trauma showed signs of close contact, a struggle between two people whose lives had become dangerously intertwined. Yet the question remained, who? Jason Miller's connection was increasingly suspect. His inconsistent alibi, and the recently discovered life insurance policy cast shadows on his motives. But without definitive proof, no eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage, no weapon tied to him, the legal threshold to charge him was still out of reach. The detectives knew that solving this case would require peeling back the layers of Laura's life, friendships, family tensions, and any possible enemies lurking in the periphery. In this endeavor, they revisited Laura's phone records and social media messages, hoping to unearth any clue she might have left behind in digital whispers. Her texts painted a picture of a young woman struggling beneath a veneer of normalcy. Some messages were mundane, coordinating meetups or sharing jokes with friends, but others hinted at growing unease, cryptic warnings about someone watching her, fleeting references to feeling trapped or threatened. One message in particular stood out, a late-night text sent just days before Laura disappeared, addressed to a close friend. It read, simply, "I think he's following me. I don't know what to do." That he remained unnamed, but the implication was clear. Laura felt pursued. The investigation widened, exploring not only Jason's potential involvement, but also any other men in Laura's life who might have harbored dark intentions. Detective Reynolds reached out to former acquaintances, ex-boyfriends and colleagues. Interviews painted a complicated portrait. Laura was a kind, intelligent woman who had struggled with anxiety and at times depression. She had been seeking counseling in recent months, trying to piece together a path forward. Her therapist, after careful consideration and with appropriate permissions, shared that Laura had indeed expressed fears about a particular individual, though she never named him outright in sessions. The therapist's notes described Laura's growing isolation, her worries about being watched at home and followed in public spaces, and her efforts to stay connected with trusted friends for safety. Yet, none of these fears seemed to reach a level that prompted official intervention before her disappearance. Meanwhile, the police also focused on the mysterious green pickup truck Carl Jensen had seen near the abandoned cabin. Records showed it belonged to a local man, Tom Harris, a quiet figure in the town, known for keeping to himself. Tom's background was checked carefully. He had a clean criminal record, but was known to struggle with anger issues, and had been involved in a handful of heated confrontations around town. When officers went to question him, they found Tom evasive and defensive. He denied being near the cabin on the night Carl described, and insisted he had no knowledge of Laura or her disappearance. Still, a search of Tom's property yielded more disturbing evidence: personal items belonging to Laura, hidden beneath piles of debris in his barn. Faced with this evidence, Tom was taken into custody. During interrogation, his demeanor shifted between angry denial and uneasy silence, but no confession came. For Detective Reynolds, this was a breakthrough. The connection between Laura and Tom had been hidden, a thread invisible until uncovered through patience and persistence. The question now was whether Tom had been responsible for her death, or if he had been involved in another way. Further investigation revealed that Laura and Tom had known each other, at least peripherally. They had crossed paths at a local grocery store, and once exchanged tense words over a parking dispute, according to witnesses. It was not a deep relationship, but it was a connection filled with friction and discomfort. Psychological profiling suggested Tom's volatile temperament might have escalated into violence, especially if he had fixated on Laura in a troubling way. His history of anger management problems and isolation painted a portrait of a man who could snap under pressure. Despite the mounting suspicion, the case was far from closed. Tom's lawyer fought aggressively, pointing out the lack of direct evidence linking him to the murder itself. No eyewitnesses had seen him with Laura that night, and there was no physical evidence proving he was at the site of her death. The trial was a tense and protracted affair. The prosecution leaned on circumstantial evidence: the cabin, the truck, the items found on his property, and Tom's evasive behavior. The defense argued reasonable doubt, suggesting that the true perpetrator remained unknown, perhaps someone Laura had feared, but had never named. Throughout the trial, Laura's family sat quietly in the courtroom, grappling with each new detail. For them, the proceedings were a bittersweet mix of hope and despair. They wanted justice, but feared the truth might remain elusive. In the end, the jury convicted Tom Harris of involuntary manslaughter, but acquitted him of murder due to insufficient evidence. The verdict brought little closure. For Detective Reynolds, it was a reminder of the limits of the justice system when faced with cases lacking definitive proof. For Laura's parents, it was a painful acknowledgement that their daughter's life had ended prematurely, without the clarity of answers they so desperately sought. The community of Maplewood was left to carry the scars. Counselors offered support to those affected, and local groups advocated for better resources to identify and intervene in cases of stalking, domestic violence, and mental health struggles. Laura's story became a catalyst for change, a quiet echo demanding vigilance and compassion. In the months and years that followed, the case remained a point of reference in law enforcement circles, an example of the challenges in uncovering truth amid incomplete evidence. Detective Reynolds continued to review cold cases, driven by the memory of Laura's courage and the hope that someday, the full story might be told. In the quiet aftermath of the trial, the town of Maplewood settled into a delicate, fragile peace. The court's verdict, while bringing some form of official closure, left many lingering questions unanswered. For Laura Bennett's family and friends, the weight of uncertainty remained heavy in the air, as persistent as the early morning fog that seemed to cling to the edges of town. Detective Mark Reynolds often found himself reflecting on the case in moments of solitude. The faces of the people involved, Laura's gentle smile, the sorrow etched into her parents' features, Tom Harris's shifting expressions, were never far from his mind. He knew that while the legal process had taken its course, the deeper human truths of the tragedy were far more complex and far less easily resolved. The community, too, was left to navigate its own path through the aftermath. Maplewood's close-knit fabric had been stretched, sometimes torn, by the brutal events of that summer. Neighbors who once waved cheerfully from porches now greeted each other with cautious nods. Conversations that once flowed freely were now measured, the silence between words heavy with shared grief and unanswered questions. Laura's parents, David and Susan Bennett, tried to find solace in small rituals, lighting a candle every evening in the window of their family home, planting wildflowers in the garden where Laura had once played as a child. They held on to memories, fragments of a life that was so full of promise yet so heartbreakingly brief. Their grief was a quiet force, one that neither shouted nor demanded attention, but was felt deeply by all who came near them. Friends and neighbors came to offer support, to listen, to remember Laura not as a victim, but as the vibrant young woman she had been. Therapists and counselors offered group sessions, inviting the town's residents to share their pain and fear, to confront the shadows left in the wake of the tragedy. These gatherings became spaces where stories were told, of loss, of resilience, and of the hope that somehow healing might be possible. Meanwhile, Detective Reynolds continued to investigate, compelled by the nagging sense that something remained undiscovered. The physical evidence had been thoroughly examined, the witness statements re-interviewed, yet the mystery seemed to linger beyond the reach of forensic science and courtroom procedure. One evening, months after the trial's conclusion, Mark found himself poring over Laura's social media accounts again. He hoped to find something new, a clue overlooked, a pattern missed. Among the familiar posts and messages, he noticed a subtle detail, a series of cryptic comments on a photo Laura had posted weeks before her disappearance. They were short, seemingly innocuous, but the tone was uneasy, as if someone was watching her closely. He traced the comments back to an anonymous account that had been deactivated shortly after Laura vanished. His instincts told him this might be a key, a digital shadow lurking just out of sight. Detective Reynolds sought help from the cybercrime unit, who managed to recover fragments of data from the deleted account. The messages contained unsettling references to Laura's movements, her daily routines, even times she was alone. The implication was clear. Someone had been tracking her closely, a silent observer hidden in the fabric of her life. This discovery reopened lines of inquiry. If Tom Harris had not been the full story, if another presence had been haunting Laura, the investigation needed to shift focus. Yet the trail was cold. The anonymous account was traced to an internet cafe outside town, but the user had vanished, leaving only digital footprints that dissolved like mist. Detective Reynolds found himself caught between the tangible and the intangible, between evidence that could be held and the shadows of suspicion that whispered but never spoke clearly. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on the Bennett family deepened. Susan, once a vibrant woman known for her warmth, retreated into herself. She began attending a support group for families affected by violent crime, seeking connection with others who understood the void left by loss. David threw himself into advocacy work, pushing for better protections for stalking victims and stronger community awareness programs. He spoke publicly at town hall meetings, his voice steady but haunted, a father's plea for justice that extended beyond the courtroom. Their efforts sparked change in Maplewood, Local law enforcement received training on identifying and responding to stalking behaviors, and the community organized safety workshops, empowering residents to watch for signs of danger in their midst. Laura's memory became a quiet beacon for this work, a reminder that vigilance and compassion might one day prevent another tragedy. Yet even as the town healed in some ways, the question of who truly ended Laura's life remained unresolved. For Detective Reynolds, the case became emblematic of the delicate balance between justice and mystery. The law demanded certainty, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but life often left truths half told, shadows half cast. He returned often to the abandoned cabin where Laura had been found, walking the worn trails and listening to the wind through the trees. There, amid the quiet whispers of the forest, he felt the weight of the unanswered questions, the echoes of a young life cut short. On one such visit, he noticed something new, faint tire tracks in the dirt, recently disturbed. He followed the path, leading to a small clearing where a discarded cell phone lay partially buried beneath leaves. The device was cracked and weathered, but powered on. Inside, messages revealed plans and meetings, but also pleas for help, texts Laura had sent in the days before her disappearance, desperate and raw. Among them was a message sent to an unknown number: "Please, I'm scared. He's here." The discovery reignited the investigation, bringing renewed hope but also reopening old wounds. Detective Reynolds shared the findings with the Bennetts, who responded with a mixture of hope and sorrow. For them, each new detail was both a step toward closure and a reminder of the void that could never be filled. Months passed, and while the search for answers continued, the community learned to live with the ambiguity. They carried Laura's story, not as a finished tale, but as an ongoing reminder of vulnerability, strength, and the complexity of human connections. The case influenced how Maplewood approached safety and support, fostering a culture of awareness and care that sought to protect the most fragile among them. And for those who had loved Laura, her memory remained a quiet presence, felt in the gentle rustling of leaves, in the soft light of dawn, and in the shared stories whispered on cool summer evenings. Her life, though tragically ended, continued to inspire compassion and vigilance. In the stillness of those moments, the town held both grief and hope, knowing that some stories do not end neatly, but live on in the hearts and actions of those left behind. Thank you for listening.